Section 30 of the History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1 by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 9, Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence, Lord Howe's arrival in America, action on Long Island, retreat of the Americans through the Jerseys and the loss of the forts Washington and Lee, affairs in Canada, surprise of the Hessians at Trenton, various transactions in the Jerseys, General Howe's retreat, makes headquarters at Brunswick, his indecision, some traits of his character. The commissioners who had been announced as the messengers of peace were now hourly expected, but the dubious aspect of their mission and the equivocal character in which they were about to appear was far from lulling to inattention the guardians of the cause of America. Their errand was ostensibly to restore peace to the colonies, but many circumstances combined to evince that the design was in reality to furnish new pretext for the prosecution of the war with redoubled vigor. Thus was the Continental Congress fully convinced of the impropriety of longer holding themselves in suspense by desultory hopes, or the uncertain termination of their expectations or their fears. They were sensible the step they were about to take would either set their country on the pinnacle of human glory or plunge it in the abject state into which turbulent and conquered colonies have been generally reduced. Yet they wisely judged that this was a proper period to break the shackles and renounce all political union with the parent state by a free and bold declaration of the independence of the American states. This measure had been contemplated by some gentlemen in the several colonies some months before it took place. They had communicated their sentiments to the individual members of Congress, but that body had been apprehensive that the people at large were not prepared to unite in a step so replete with important consequences. But the moment of decision had now arrived, when both the Congress and the inhabitants of the colonies advanced too far to recede. Richard Henry Lee, Esquire, a delegate from the state of Virginia, a gentleman of distinguished abilities, uniform patriotism, and unshaken firmness and integrity, was the first who dared explicitly to propose that this decided measure on which hung such mighty consequences should no longer be delayed. This public and unequivocal proposal, from a man of his virtue and shining qualities, appeared to spread a kind of sudden dismay. A silent astonishment for a few minutes seemed to pervade the whole assembly. This was soon succeeded by a long debate and a considerable division of sentiment on the important question. After the short silence just observed, the measure proposed by Mr. Lee was advocated with peculiar zeal by John Adams, Esquire, of the Massachusetts Bay. He rose with the face of intrepidity and the voice of energy, and invoked the God of eloquence to enable him to do justice to the cause of his country, and to enforce this important step in such a manner as might silence all opposition, and convince everyone of the necessity of an immediate declaration of the independence of the United States of America. Mr. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania took the lead in opposition to the boldness and danger of this decided measure. He had drawn the petition to the king forwarded by Mr. Penn, and though no man was more strenuous in support of the rights of the colonies, he had always been averse to a separation from Britain and shuddered at the idea of an avowed revolt of the American colonies. He arose on this occasion with no less solemnity than Mr. Adams had recently done, and with equal pathos of expression and more brilliance of epithet. He invoked the great governor of the universe to animate him with powers of language sufficient to exhibit a view of the dread consequences to both countries that such a hasty dismemberment of the empire might produce. He descanted largely on the happy effects that might probably ensue from more patient and conciliatory dispositions, and urged at least a temporary suspension of a step that could never be revoked. He declared that it was his opinion that even policy forbade the precipitation of this measure, and that humanity more strongly dictated that they ought to wait longer the success of petitions and negotiations before they formally renounced their allegiance to the King of Great Britain, broke off all connection with England, plunged alone into an unequal war, and rushed without allies into the unforeseen and inevitable dangers that attended it. The consequences of such a solemn act of separation were indeed of serious and extensive magnitude. The energy of brilliant talents and great strength of argument were displayed by both parties on this weighty occasion. The reasons urging the necessity of decision and the indubitable danger of delay were clear and cogent, the objections plausible, humane, and important. But after a fair discussion of the question, an accurate statement of the reasons for adopting the measure, and a candid scrutiny of the objections against it, grounded either on policy or humanity, a large majority of the members of Congress appeared in favor of an immediate renunciation of allegiance to the Crown, or any future subjugation to the King of Great Britain. A declaration of the independence of America and the sovereignty of the United States was drawn by the ingenious and philosophic pen of Thomas Jefferson, Esquire, a delegate from the state of Virginia. Footnote: This wise and patriotic statesman was afterwards appointed ambassador to the court of France. On the adoption of the present constitution of government, he was appointed secretary for foreign affairs, was chosen vice president, and afterwards president of the United States of America. End of footnote. The delegates from 12 of the American states agreed almost unanimously to this declaration, the language, the principles, and the spirit of which were equally honorable to themselves and their country. Footnote: The members from Maryland seceded, but in a short time after joined the Confederation. End of footnote. It was signed by John Hancock, then President of Congress, on the 4th of July, 1776. The allegiance of 13 states at once withdrawn by a solemn declaration from a government towards which they had looked with the highest veneration, whose authority they had acknowledged, whose laws they had obeyed, whose protection they had claimed for more than a century and a half, was a consideration of solemnity, a bold resolution, an experiment of hazard, especially when the infancy of the colonies as a nation, without wealth, resources, or allies, was contrasted with the strength, riches, and power of Great Britain. The timid trembled at the ideas of final separation. The disciples of passive obedience were shocked by a reflection of a breach of faith to their ancient sovereign, and the enemies to the general freedom of mankind were incensed to madness or involved in despair. But these classes bore a small proportion to those who resented the rejection of their petitions, and coolly surveyed the impending dangers that threatened themselves and their children, which rendered it clear to their apprehension that this step was necessary to their political salvation. They considered themselves no longer bound by any moral tie to render fealty to a sovereign thus disposed to encroach on their civil freedom, which they could now secure only by a social compact among themselves, and which they determined to maintain or perish in the attempt. By the Declaration of Independence, dreaded by the foes, and for a time doubtfully viewed by many of the friends of America, everything stood on a new and more respectable footing, both with regard to the operations of war or negotiations with foreign powers. Americans could now no more be considered as rebels in their proposals for treaties of peace and conciliation with Britain. They were a distinct people who claimed the rights, the usages, the faith, and the respective nations uncontrolled by any foreign power. The colonies thus irretrievably lost to Great Britain. A new face appeared on all affairs, both at home and abroad. America had been little known among the kingdoms of Europe. She was considered only as an appendage to the power of Britain. The principles of her sons were in some respects dissimilar, and their manners not yet brought up to the standard of refinement reigning in ancient courts. Her statesmen in general were unacquainted with the intrigues necessary for negotiation, and the finesse usually hackneyed in and about the cabinets of princes. She now appeared in their eyes, a new theatre, pregnant with events that might be interesting to the civil and political institutions of nations that had never before paid much attention to the growth, population, and importance of an immense territory beyond the Atlantic. The United States had their ambassadors to create, or to transplant from the bar or the compting house. Their generals were many of them the yeomanry or the tradesmen of the country. Their subordinate officers had been of equal rank and fortune, and the army to be governed was composed of many of the old associates of the principal officers, and were equally tenacious of personal liberty. The regalia of power, orders of nobility, and the splendor of courts had been by them viewed only at a distance. The discipline of armies was entirely new. The difficulty of connecting many distinct states to act as if it were by one will. The expenses of government in new exigencies, and the waste of war had not yet been accurately calculated by their politicians and statesmen. But their senators, their representatives, and their magistrates were generally sagacious and vigilant, upright and firm. Their officers were brave, their troops in spirits, and with a full confidence in their commander-in-chief. Hope was exhilarated by the retreat from Boston and the repeated successes of their arms at the southward, while new dignity was added to office and stronger motives for illustrious action by the rank America had now taken among the nations. Thus, by the Declaration of Independence, they had new ground to tread. The scene of action was changed. Genius was called forth from every quarter of the continent, and the public expectation enhanced by the general favorable appearance in all their military operations. In this situation stood affairs, both in the cabinet and the field, when Lord Howe arrived at Staten Island, with a formidable squadron under his command, on the 12th of July, 1776. At the head of this hostile arrangement, his lordship came in full confidence of success, yet amidst the splendor and parade of war, while he held out his potent arm, he still cherished the desultory hope of peace. By a pompous declaration, he early announced his specific powers to principal magistrates of the several colonies, and promised pardon to all who, in the late times, had deviated from their allegiance on condition that they would speedily return to their duty, and gave encouragement that they should, on compliance, hereafter reap the benefit of royal favor. Lord Howe observed in his declaration that the commissioners were authorized in His Majesty's name to declare any province, colony, county, district, or town to be at the peace of His Majesty, and that due consideration should be had to the meritorious services of any who should aid or assist in restoring the public tranquillity, that their dutiful representations should be received, pardons granted, and suitable encouragement to such as would promote the measures of legal government and peace, in pursuance of His Majesty's most gracious purposes. Footnote: This declaration, and the consequent resolves of Congress, may be seen at large in the public journals of the session of 1776. End of footnote. Congress ordered the declaration to be immediately published in all the American gazettes, that the people of the United States may be fully informed of the terms of peace, that they might see for themselves that the business of the commissioners was to amuse, disunite, and deceive them, and that those who still continued in suspense from hopes founded either on the justice or moderation of the court of Great Britain, might now be fully convinced that their own valor, virtue, and firmness must rescue and preserve the freedom of their country. Footnote: the American Congress were not remiss at this time in exerting their efforts to detach foreigners from the service of Britain, and alluring them to become inhabitants of the United States, by promising them a quiet residence, an allotment of lands, and a security from all interruptions in the enjoyment of their religious opinions, and the investiture of all the privileges of native citizens. End of footnote. The next advance his lordship made for the execution of his commission was by a flag sent on shore within a few days after his arrival, with a letter directed to George Washington, Esquire. By their principles and their professions, the Americans were taught at this period to look down on titles and distinguished ranks. Yet, in this instance, they did not think proper to pass over the implicit denial of either to their commander-in-chief. It was viewed as a designed affront from those who consider such adventitious circumstances of so much consequence as carefully to avoid all honorary epithets in their addresses to the first officers of the United States. It was thought more becoming the dignity of his station, both as a soldier and a patriot, for the chief commander to refuse an address that tacitly denied the legality of his commission, and the right now claimed of negotiating on terms of equality. This letter was therefore, by the advice of the principal officers, returned unopened. This drew out a second advance from the hands of the British commissioners, when Major Patterson, Adjutant General of the Army, was charged with the letter directed to George Washington, etc., etc., etc. He was received in military state, and treated with great politeness in the American camp. His lordship, in this second address, expressed the highest respect for the private character of General Washington, but as he did not yet condescend to acknowledge the commander-in-chief of the American troops as anything more than a rebel in arms, this letter was also returned without breaking the seal. Many civilities passed in this interview with Mr. Patterson, who did not forget to insinuate his own wishes for the restoration of friendship and harmony between the two countries. He, with due propriety, made several observations on the extensive powers vested in the commissioners for this salutary purpose. This introduced some general conversation relative to the treatment of prisoners on both sides. The conference was of some length, but as no circumstance indicated a happy result from the negotiation, General Washington, in the most explicit terms, informed the British Adjutant General that the inhabitants of the American states were generally of opinion that a people armed in defense of their rights were in the way of their duty, that conscious of no criminality, they needed no pardon, and as his lordship's commission extended no farther, nothing important could be expected from protracting the negotiation. In the meantime, reinforcements were daily dropping into the assistance of the British Army. The scattered divisions of Hessians, Waldeckers, etc., designed for the summer campaign, had been somewhat retarded by not knowing with certainty the spot destined for headquarters. They had, some of them, sailed directly for Halifax. This occasioned a delay of any energetic movement until the latter part of the month of August, when the British Army began to act with vigor. End of section 30.
Section 31 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Leinhart. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 9, Part 2. General Washington had rather incautiously encamped the bulk of his army on Long Island, a large and plentiful district about 2 miles from the city of New York. This island contained many settlements through an extent of 120 miles in length. It was inhabited principally by loyalists and persons generally disaffected to the American cause. Many were at a loss for a reason, nor indeed could any conjecture why the commander of the American army should hazard his troops on an island liable at any moment to be surrounded by the British Navy. However it was, several thousand Americans were there posted under the command of the Generals Putnam, Sullivan, and William Alexander, Lord Stirling. Sir William Howe very wisely judged that it was a less arduous and a more promising undertaking to dislodge the Americans from their encampment on the island than a direct attempt to reduce New York. The Royal Army at that time consisted of about 30,000 men. These he found no difficulty in landing from Staten Island, and in detachments posted them from one end of Long Island to the other, separated from the Americans by a ridge of hills covered with woods. Very fortunately for the enterprise of the British, one of the American outguards early fell into the hands of General Clinton. In consequence of some intelligence gained by this accident, he, before daylight on the morning of the 27th of August, possessed himself of some very advantageous heights, and made such a judicious arrangement of his troops as might have ensured success, even had the Americans been better prepared for the attack, which at that time was rather unexpected. The assault was begun by the Hessian General de Heister. He opened the cannonade in front of the American lines early on the morning of the 28th. A general engagement speedily ensued. Nearly the whole of the British forces were called into action under the command of Sir Henry Clinton, Earl Percy, and Lord Cornwallis. By some fatal neglect, a very important post was left unguarded by the American, which was seized by the British troops, who fought on this occasion with a spirit and bravery becoming the experienced commander and the hardy veteran. The American troops were early deranged. Apprised of their danger, they with great resolution endeavored to recover their camp, but nearly surrounded by the British and pushed in the center by the Hessians, they were so far from effecting their design that their retreat was nearly cut off. Yet many of them desperately fought their way through some of the British lines and again bravely stood on their defense. Others, entangled in the woods and marshes through which they endeavored to escape, were either captured or perished in the attempt. In the midst of the general anxiety for the danger and distress of the little army on Long Island, General Washington, undoubtedly anxious to retrieve his mistake in thus exposing them, passed over from New York to endeavor to secure the retreat of the surviving troops. This was executed in the night of the 29th, without noise or tumult. The remainder of the broken regiments that had outlived the fatal action abandoned the island with a considerable part of their baggage, some artillery, and military stores, and without molestation reached the city of New York. They had made a bold and resolute stand against far superior numbers and discipline, and it may be deemed fortunate that any of them escaped, as on an island they might easily have been hemmed in by a small number of British ships. Perhaps the commanders on both sides were afterwards sensible of their error, the one in hazarding his troops in such an exposed situation, the other in suffering a single American to escape either captivity or death. The loss of men in this action was not inconsiderable on either side, but it fell most heavily on the Americans. Many brave men perished by the sword. Others, as was observed, were lost in the morasses and swamps to which they had fled on the defeat. 3 general officers and a large number of inferior rank were made prisoners. A regiment of valiant young men from Maryland, many of them of family and fortune, commanded by the gallant Colonel Smallwood, were almost to a man cut off. The misfortune of the day was severely felt by them, but without checking the ardor of the American army, the people, or the Continental Congress. The same uniform dignity An unruffled superiority of mind appeared in the judicious determinations of the united delegates, in the conduct of the State Departments, and in the subsequent firmness of most of the military officers as before this defeat. But the success of their arms and the acquisition of Long Island exhilarated the spirits of the British, and gave hopes of more compliant dispositions and a more ready acquiescence in the requisitions of ministers or the veto of kings, and that the business of the commissioners might now be brought forward without further impediment. Not many days after the retreat from Long Island, Congress was called upon to exhibit a new proof of their firmness. General Sullivan, one of the captured officers, was dispatched on parole with a message to that assembly in the joint names of Lord and General Howe. The purport of the message was that they had full powers and that they were disposed to treat on terms of accommodation and peace. At the same time, they intimated that as Congress was not considered in the eye of majesty as a legal assembly, they only desired a private conference with a few individuals belonging to that body, in the character and capacity of private gentlemen. To this extraordinary request, which threw them into a very delicate situation, Congress replied that as delegates of a free and independent people, they could, with no propriety, send any of the members of Congress in a private capacity on an errand so replete with public consequences, but they would depute a committee from their body to inquire by what authority and on what terms his lordship and brother were empowered to negotiate. The insidious message received had no tendency to eradicate the previous opinion of Congress that this was but a ministerial pretext to palliate their injurious designs. They were convinced that the commission of the agents was derogatory to the great national councils and to that high authority which had vested the British commissioners with no powers but to pardon those who deemed themselves guiltless, and with no conciliatory proposals at which freemen would not spurn unless driven to despair. Yet they condescended so far to this political trifling as to depute a very respectable committee to meet Lord Howe and confer on the subject. The celebrated Dr. Franklin, the Honorable Mr. Rutledge of South Carolina, and John Adams, Esquire, of the Massachusetts, were the persons chosen for this singular interview. On a stipulated day they met his lordship on Staten Island, accompanied only by Mr. Strachey as secretary. He received them with much civility, but conversed equivocally, and though careful not to be explicit, it did not require the penetration of men of far less superior abilities to discover that he was restricted to very narrow limits for a negotiator between contending nations. It was evident that he had no plan of accommodation or any proposals for amity on any terms but those of absolute and unconditional submission. Yet these gentlemen patiently attended to the circumvolutions of his lordship, who observed neither precision or perspicuity in his modes of conversing, nor could he disguise an apparent embarrassment under the display of affability and good humor. It was even painful to see a British nobleman endowed with talents for the most honorable employments thus reduced to act under a veil of intrigue, inconsistent with the character of the gentleman or the man of business. Note: the above detail of the interview on Staten Island was soon after verbally related to the author of these annals by one of the committee of conference. End note. This conference continued 3 or 4 hours, when a short and frugal repast concluded a negotiation that had fed many well-meaning people with delusory hopes, and for several months had been the subject of political speculation both in Europe and America. This singular interview had indeed little other effect than, on the one side, to rivet that strong disgust which before existed against the treacherous counsels of the British ministry and Parliament, and on the other, to convince more perfectly the agents of monarchy of the determined spirit of America, and the ability of the men with whom she had entrusted the security of her rights. However, when the parties took leave of each other, it was not without some tender emotions. Dr. Franklin had been in long habits of friendship and intimacy with Lord Howe. They had, in England, frequently conversed, and afterwards corresponded on the parliamentary dispute with America. Their regard for each other was mutual, and as there was now every reason to suppose this would be the last personal interview between them, the idea was painful that this political storm might sweep away all remains of private friendship. Note: in the familiar conversation between Lord Howe and Dr. Franklin, his lordship expressed a regard for the Americans and the pain he felt for their approaching sufferings. Dr. Franklin, in his easy, sententious manner, thanked him for his regards and assured him that, quote, the Americans would show their gratitude by endeavoring to lessen as much as possible all pain he might feel on their account by exerting their utmost abilities in taking good care of themselves. End quote, end note. It was not long after all ideas of negotiation were relinquished before the commissioners and their sovereign had the most positive proofs that though the villages might be disdained with the crimson tide that threatened to deluge the land, yet freedom in her last asylum would resist the designs of all who had sighed for her annihilation to the last moment of her existence. The late defeat of the Americans and the entire possession of Long Island threw accumulated advantages into the hand of the British commander, who made immediate preparation to attack and take possession of the city of New York. In consequence of these movements, General Washington, advised by the most judicious of his officers, thought it prudent to evacuate the city without further delay. Note: General Lee particularly, who had just arrived from Georgia. He, by urging this advice, may be said to share in the merit of saving the American army. End note. It would indeed have been madness to have attempted a longer defense with his diminished numbers against a potent army flushed with recent success. The American army was drawn off from above Kingsbridge on the 21st of October, but a day before the British took possession of the city. General Washington encamped his retreating troops on the heights of Harlem, about 9 miles distance from Kingsbridge. When General Howe took possession of the evacuated post, he must, from this event, undoubtedly have felt some consolation for the mortification he had suffered on recollecting the circumstances of his flight from Boston. The alternate triumph or chagrin from the uncertain chances and events of war are generally of short duration. The Americans, now in their turn, experienced the pains of anxiety, disappointment, and want through a rapid flight from post to post before a victorious army who despised their weakness and ridiculed their want of discipline. General Howe placed a strong detachment in the garrison for the defense of the city of New York and immediately marched with the main body of his army in pursuit of Washington. He crossed East River, seized a point of land near Westchester, and made himself master of the lower road to Connecticut, with design to impede the intercourse between the northern and southern states. By this movement, he also hoped to impel the American commander at every hazard to risk an engagement that might probably have been decisive. But General Washington was too well acquainted with human nature to suffer his troops, though ardent for action and impatient of delay, to trust to the impulse of constitutional courage and expose the reputation of the American arms and the decision of the great contest to the uncertain events of a day, under the present disadvantages of number and discipline. A second defeat in so short a time would undoubtedly have spread dismay, and perhaps a defection that might have been fatal to the independence of America. Note: this opinion was corroborated by the behavior of the Americans when the British landed from Kep's Bay, September 15. They discovered a timidity that nothing can excuse, but their recent sufferings on Long Island, their inferior numbers, and their dread of the superior discipline of British troops. End note. He was sensible his troops, though naturally brave, were not sufficiently inured to danger and hardened by experience to raise the mind to that sublime pitch of enthusiasm and inflexibility necessary to stand their ground against superior strength, discipline, and numbers. He therefore determined, by cautious and guarded marches, to keep in flank with the British army until circumstances might put it in his power to combat on more equal terms. End of section 31. Section 32 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Leinhart. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 9, Part 3. He placed a strong party in Fort Washington, a fortress near Kingsbridge, which, though well provided, was at the time judged not tenable by some of his best officers. This opinion was overruled, and between 3,000 and 4,000 men were left there. This was considered by many a second fatal mistake of the renowned Washington. Note. General Washington, however, was undoubtedly advised to this step by several of his best officers. End note. With the remainder of the army, the commander-in-chief decamped and moved towards the high grounds on the upper road to Boston. The possession of this part of the country was an important object. Of consequence, the Americans were closely pursued by General Howe, who did not yet relinquish his hopes for a decisive action. Frequent skirmishes had taken place on the route, without material advantages on either side, but on the 28th of October, the British overtook the American army near the White Plains, 30 miles distant from New York City, when an action of moment ensued. The attack was begun by the Hessians, the forlorn hope of the British army. They were commanded by General de Heister and Colonel Rall. Equal resolution animated both parties, and a considerable slaughter among the troops on both sides took place. Note. Among the slain was the valiant Colonel Smallwood, whose regiment was nearly cut to pieces in the action on Long Island. End note. The Americans, unable to bear these losses, fully apprised of the strength of their enemy, and that reinforcements had recently arrived under Lord Percy, both the American commander and the army were equally unwilling to take a more distant position. The British army had gained several very important advantages, among which was the command of the River Bronx, which was passed by Colonel Rall, who by this means acquired a very important post, which enabled him essentially to annoy the American army. The action on the White Plains was a well-fought battle on both sides, but the Americans had neither the numbers, the experience, nor the equipments for war at that time, which rendered them equally able to cope with the strength, the numbers, the preparation, and the valor of the British army, under officers whose trade had long been that of war. And though the American commander made his escape with his final armament, and retreated with all the prudence and firmness of a general who had been long tried in the field of action, the British had certainly a right in this affair to boast a complete victory. Note. The town of White Plains was set on fire after the action, and all the houses and forage near the lines burnt. This the British writers charge to the account of the American commander. End note. After the engagement, General Washington found it necessary to quit the field. He drew back in the night to his entrenchments, and the next day took possession of some higher grounds about the distance of 2 miles. General Howe, after parading a few days near the late scene of action and indiscriminately plundering the neighborhood, ordered his tents to be struck and the movement of his whole army to be made towards New York. As his troops had long been kept in continual motion, were fatigued and harassed by sudden alarms, and the season far advanced, it was rationally concluded that his design was to repair immediately to winter quarters. But by a stroke of generalship, little expected where no remarkable superiority in military knowledge had yet been discovered, affairs took a most unfavorable turn for the Americans, and reduced the little resolute Continental Army to dangers and distresses, to exertions and vigor scarcely to be paralleled in history. The numbers that had already fallen on both sides by the rapid movements and frequent skirmishes for the space of 3 or 4 months cannot be ascertained with exactitude. It was computed that not less than 5,000, principally Hessians, either perished or deserted from the ministerial army after the action of Long Island to the middle of November, when General Howe laid the estimate before Lord George Germain. Note: in General Howe's letter to the Secretary for American Affairs, he acknowledged he had lost upwards of 300 staff and other officers, and between 4,000 and 5,000 privates. End note. The Americans undoubtedly suffered in more than equal proportion, and from many causes were much less able to bear the reduction. The peculiar mode of raising troops hitherto adopted by the United States had a tendency to retard the operations of war, and in some measure to defeat the best concerted plans, either for enterprise or defense. The several colonies had furnished their quota of men for a limited term only, and the country, unused to standing armies and the control of military power, impatient at the subordination necessary in a camp, and actuated by a strong sense of the liberty of the individual, each one had usually returned to his habitation at the expiration of his term of service, in spite of every danger that threatened the whole. This had occasioned frequent calls on the militia of the country in aid of the army thus weakened, and kept in continual fluctuation by raw recruits, raised and sent on for a few months at a time. In addition to these embarrassments, animosities had sometimes arisen between the Southern and Eastern troops, occasioned by the revival of some old local prejudices. The aristocratic spirit that had been formerly characteristic of the South frequently appeared in airs of assumed superiority, very disgusting to the feelings of their Eastern brethren, the bold and hardy New Englanders, the full-blooded Yankees, as they sometimes boasted themselves, who, having few slaves at their command, had always been used to more equality of condition, both in rank, fortune, and education. These trivial causes sometimes raised animosities to such a height that in the present circumstances of the army, the authority of the commander-in-chief was scarcely sufficient to restrain them. General Washington was also obliged often in his retreat through the Jerseys to press for provisions, forage, and clothing in a manner new to the inhabitants of America, who, as their misfortunes seemed to thicken, grew more remiss for a time in voluntary aids to the army. Their grain was seized and threshed out for the use of the troops, their blankets, provisions, etc., forcibly taken from their houses, with a promise of payment in paper bills when the exigencies of the country should permit, but it always appeared to the people the act of some subordinate officers rather than the order of the commander-in-chief. Thus was his popularity kept up, and thus were the inhabitants of the Jerseys plundered by each party, while many of them disaffected to both were uncertain on which side to declare. General Howe, well acquainted with these embarrassing circumstances, and apprised that Congress were taking measures to remedy the evils in future, wisely judged that as he could not force Washington to a general engagement, it would be more advantageous for the present to suspend his pursuit and dislodge the Americans from their strongholds in the environs of New York. He was too sensible, from the causes above related, that the Continental Army would diminish of itself as soon as the term of their enlistment expired. From these considerations, he drew back his army with a determination to invest Fort Washington immediately. Note: near Kingsbridge, 15 miles from the city of New York. End note. This fortress on the one side of the North River and Fort Lee on the opposite shore commanded the whole navigation of the river at the same time that it impeded the communication with New York by land. General Washington could not rationally suppose that a post of so much importance would remain long unmolested, or that the garrison could be defended against the whole force of the British Army. General Lee afterwards boasted in a letter to a friend that he had advised the evacuation of both Fort Washington and Fort Lee previous to the main body of the American army leaving the neighborhood of New York. However this might have been, it was indeed a great mistake that it was not done. General Washington might then have had the assistance of the brave men who fell there. Note: an officer of the Army wrote to General Lee after the surrender of Fort Washington and expressed himself thus, quote, "We have all additional reasons for most earnestly wishing to have you where the principal scene of action is laid. I have no doubt, had you been here, the garrison of Mount Washington would now have composed a part of this army. Every gentleman of the family, the officers and soldiers generally, have a confidence in you. The enemy constantly inquire where you are, and seem to me to be less confident when you are present. We are informed by an officer lately liberated that the enemy have a southern expedition in view, that they hold us very cheap in consequence of the late affair at Mount Washington, where both the plan of defense and execution were contemptible. If a real defense of the lines was intended, the number was too few. If the fort only, the garrison was too numerous by half." End quote. Extract from General Reed to General Lee. End note. General Knyphausen, with 6 battalions, suddenly crossed the country from Rochelle to Kingsbridge, where, joined by the light infantry and grenadiers, the one commanded by Lord Cornwallis, the other by Earl Percy, the fort was on all sides attacked with vigor and defended with bravery. On the 16th of November, Colonel McGaw, the commanding officer, was summoned to surrender without further delay. He requested that he might be allowed to consider till 9 o'clock the next morning before he gave a decisive answer. It was replied that 2 hours only were granted. At the expiration of this short parley, the Adjutant General of the British Army, who waited the reply, was informed that the fort would be defended to the last moment. Accordingly, a resistance was made with astonishing valor for several hours, but to prevent the farther effusion of blood, the Americans yielded to necessity and surrendered themselves prisoners of war at the moment when the Hessian and British troops were on the point of storming the garrison. Near 3,000 Continental troops were lost by this disaster. These unhappy victims of war, notwithstanding the inclemency of the season, were stripped of their apparel and thrown naked into the jails of New York, where, after suffering the extremes of misery from cold, hunger, and sickness, most of them perished. The remnant who escaped immediate death were, after some months' imprisonment, sent on parole to visit their friends, many of them infected with the smallpox, and all of them in such a languishing, emaciated condition as proved a useful lesson to their countrymen, who by this instance of severity towards the brave and unfortunate were universally convinced that death in the field of battle was much to be preferred to the cruelties they had reason to expect if they fell into British hands, though a nation once famed for the virtues of justice, generosity, and clemency. After the surrender of Fort Washington, no time was lost. The advantages gained by the British troops were pushed with spirit. With the utmost ease, they took possession of Fort Lee. The American garrison fled on the first apprehension of an attack, without offering the smallest resistance. General Howe embraced these favorable circumstances to prosecute his designs, stimulated by the hope of reaching and surprising Philadelphia before the American army could be reinforced. Thus, near the close of the campaign, when the Continental troops were daily dropping off and a severe winter setting in, he had every reason to cherish his most sanguine hopes. He for some time pushed his purposes with vigor and alacrity, and obliged General Washington with a handful of men to retreat from town to town until hunted through the state of New Jersey and even over the Delaware, which he had time to cross only 6 hours before the whole body of the British Army, consisting of 10 or 12,000 men, were on the opposite banks. The reasons why General Howe did not sooner overtake the distressed fugitives, or why he cantoned his troops without crossing the river and taking possession of the city of Philadelphia, remain yet to be investigated. The retreat was conducted with ability, but the remnant that escaped was too small to intimidate the enemy or to encourage the friends of the American cause. A great part of the inhabitants of the city, either from fear, affection, or interest, were at that time disposed to receive with open arms the British commander, and the consternation of all parties operated in favor of erecting the King's standard in the capital of America. End of section 32. Section 33 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Leinhart. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 9, Part 4. Congress, by advice of some military characters, precipitately removed to Baltimore in the state of Maryland. The public concern was also heightened at this critical period by the recent capture of General Lee. He had been collecting a number of militia in the neighborhood of Morristown, with the design to fall on the rear of the British Army while in chase of Washington through the Jerseys. It is not known why he was thus unguarded, but he incautiously lodged at the little village of Baskinridge, 4 miles from the troops he had collected and about 20 from the British Army. Here he was betrayed, surprised, and taken prisoner. Colonel Harcourt of the Light Horse conducted the enterprise with so much address that with a very small party he without noise passed all the American guards on his way, surrounded the house, and took possession of his prisoner without the smallest resistance. In the hurry of the business, Lee was not suffered to take either hat or cloak, and thus, in a ruffian-like manner, was he conducted to the British headquarters. A peculiar triumph was enjoyed by his enemies in the capture of this single officer. They considered his services at that period of the greatest consequence to the American army. In addition to this, he was viewed as a rebel to the sovereign of Britain in a double sense, both as a deserter from the king's service, in which he had long held an honorable rank, and as an abettor of the American defection, and one of the first officers in their army. He was, of course, confined in the strictest manner, and threatened with military execution as a traitor to the king. The Americans at that time had no British prisoners of equal rank, yet they made the most strenuous efforts for his release. A Colonel Campbell, with 5 Hessian field officers, were soon after offered for the exchange of General Lee. When this was refused, General Washington advertised Sir William Howe that their blood must atone for his life if Lee fell a sacrifice to the resentment of his enemies. Humanity recoils at the sufferings of individuals who, by the laws of retaliation, are deemed the legal victims of policy. But though the mind of the gentle may be wounded by the necessity, habit, in time, too often learns it to acquiesce in the cruel policy of nations. Public emergencies may require the hand of severity to fall heavily on those who are not personally guilty, but compassion prompts and ever urges to milder methods. However, General Lee was not executed, nor suddenly released. Colonel Campbell was closely imprisoned and treated with much severity, and a considerable time elapsed before either of them were relieved, except by some mitigation in the manner of Colonel Campbell's confinement, which was carried to an extreme not warranted even to a notorious felon. Note: General Lee was also treated very severely until the defeat of Burgoyne. After this, he was permitted to repair to New York on parole, and soon after liberated by an exchange of prisoners. End note. Perhaps at no period of the great struggle for independence were the affairs of the United States at so low an ebb as at the present. The footsteps of the British Army in their route through the Jerseys were everywhere marked with the most wanton instances of rapine and bloodshed. Even the sacred repositories of the dead were not unmolested by the sacrilegious hands of the soldiery. Note: this usage of the dead is authenticated by the accounts of several gentlemen of respectability near the scene of action. End note. While the licentiousness of their officers spread rape, misery, and despair indiscriminately through every village. Thus, while human nature was disgraced and the feelings of benevolence shocked by the perpetration of every crime, when the army spared neither age or sex, youth, beauty, or innocence, it is observable that the distress of war had fallen principally on that state which at that time contained a greater proportion of persons attached to the royal cause than could have been found in any other part of America. But so intermixed and blended were persons, families, and parties of different political opinions that it was not easy to distinguish, in the wanton riot of victory, their friends from their foes, or the royalists from the Whigs, even had the royal army been disposed to discriminate. It was indeed impossible for their foreign auxiliaries to make any distinction among Americans, though some British officers would gladly have checked the insolence of triumph unbalanced by any principle of religion, honor, or humanity. A neglect of strict discipline prevented the melioration of crime and misery, and filled up the measure of censure which afterwards fell on the commander-in-chief of the British forces, even from those who wished to give his military operations the most brilliant cast. Note: see Sir William Howe's defense of his conduct in his Letters to Administration, published in London. End note. Had General Howe persevered in his pursuit and have crossed the Delaware, he would inevitably have destroyed even the vestige of an American army. The remnant of the old troops drawn into Philadelphia was too small for resistance. The citizens were divided and intimidated. Congress had retreated to Baltimore. The country was dispirited, and Washington himself, ready to despair, had actually consulted some of his officers on the expediency of flying to the back parts of Pennsylvania, or even beyond the Allegheny Mountains, to escape the usual fate of unsuccessful rebels, or, as himself expressed it, to save his neck from a halter. Note: this was confidentially said to an officer, who reported that the general put his hand to his neck and observed that it did not feel as if made for a halter. See Stedman's History. It is probable if ever General Washington really expressed himself in this manner, it was uttered more from the momentary ebullition of distress than from the serious contemplation of despair. It discovered more a determination to live free than any timidity from sudden dismay. Had General Howe overtaken the American troops and have secured their commander, he would doubtless have been made a victim of severe vengeance. End note. Thus, without an army, without allies, and without resources, the gloom of disappointment overspread not only the brow of the commander-in-chief, but expanded wide, and ruin from every quarter lowered on the face of American freedom. Newport and the adjacent islands were taken possession of by a part of the British Army and Navy under the command of Commodore Sir Peter Parker and Sir Henry Clinton. The whole colony of Rhode Island was not able to make the smallest resistance to the seizure of their capital, and to complete the climax of danger which this melancholy winter exhibited, the eruptions of the natives in various parts was not the least. Many tribes of those aborigines, stimulated by their native fierceness, wrought up still higher by British influence, and headed by some American desperadoes in the service of Britain, were making the most horrid depredations on the back settlements of some of the southern states, nor did the affairs of America at the northward wear a more favorable aspect. General Carleton had conducted the campaign of this year with the ability of the statesman and the courage of the soldier, and notwithstanding the severity of his general character, he, with a degree of humanity honorable to himself and exemplary to his military associates, had been disposed to commiserate the unfortunate. It has been observed that all who fell into his hands after the death of General Montgomery were treated with lenity and tenderness. He was doubtless sensible that a war enkindled more to satiate a spirit of resentment and pride than to establish the principles of justice, required every palliative to mitigate the odium of the disgraceful design of subduing America by the aid of savages who had hutted for ages in the wilderness beyond the distant lakes. General Carleton, with the most extraordinary vigilance and vigor, had conducted the pursuit of the Americans until Arnold and his party were chased out of the province of Quebec, nor did he ever lose sight of his object, which was to make himself master of the Hudson and form a junction at Albany with General Howe, whose troops in detached parties were wasting the middle colonies and cooperating in the same design. By uncommon exertions, Carleton obtained a fleet in the wilderness of such strength and superiority as to destroy the little American squadron on the Lake Champlain, one of the smaller navigable basins in the woods of that astonishing country. The lakes of America are among the wonders of the world. They are numerous and extensive, deep and navigable at many hundred miles distance from the ocean. A view of this part of creation is sublime and astonishing. There are 5 of those lakes of principal magnitude. The smallest of them, Lake Ontario, is more than 200, and the largest, Lake Superior, is 500 leagues in circumference. Note: the principal of these inland seas are Lake Superior, Huron, Michigan, Erie, and Ontario. The description of these and the smaller sheets of water spread over the vast western territory may be found in every geographical work. End note. Happy might it have been for the Atlantic States had they been contented within these boundaries of nature, and not at an after period have wasted the blood of their citizens in attempting to wrest from the natives a vast extent of territory, which it is very improbable they will be long able to govern, unless a remarkable coincidence of events should give them a commanding influence superior to any European power. The bravery of Arnold was on his retreat, equally conspicuous with the outset of his extraordinary undertaking, but notwithstanding his vigilance and the valor of his soldiers, they were reduced to the utmost distress before he blew up the remainder of his fleet, which Carleton had not captured, and run his last ship on shore without acknowledging the superiority of the British flag by the servile signal of striking his colors. Obliged to relinquish every post of advantage, Arnold and the remnant of his troops were driven naked, defenseless, and despondent from forest to forest and from lake to lake until they reached Ticonderoga. The garrison there had been reinforced by some militia from the eastern states, but they were in no condition to meet General Carleton, whose advancement they had every reason to expect, with superior numbers and the double advantage of discipline and success, and his exertions aided by tribes of copper-colored savages. General Thomas had been sent from Cambridge in the spring, 1776, with a detachment of the Continental Army, to endeavor in conjunction with the Eastern militia to retrieve the wretched state of affairs in Canada. He was a man of cool judgment, possessed of courage, the result of principle, rather than bravery, the impulse of passion. He was respected by the citizens, beloved by the soldiers, and well qualified by the firmness of his mind and the strength of his constitution to face the dangers of a campaign in the wilderness. But unfortunately for him, he was deputed to the Northern Command to oppose the conjoined forces of the native barbarians and their British allies at a time when the remains of the American army were dismayed by defeat, worn out by fatigue, and in addition to their distresses, a pestilential disorder, then fatal to New Englanders, had spread through the camp. The smallpox, by the ill policy of the country, had been so long kept from their doors that there was scarce a man among them who was not more afraid of an attack from this kind of pestilence than the fury of the sword. But no caution could prevent the rapidity of the contagion. It pervaded the whole army, and proved fatal to most of the new raised troops. The character of the military officer who dies in his bed, however meritorious, is seldom crowned by the eclat of fame which follows the hero who perishes in the field. Thus this good man, qualified to reap the fairest laurels in a day of battle, was immediately on his arrival at the scene of action cut down by the hand of sickness, and his memory almost extinguished by a succession of new characters and events that crowded for attention. By the death of General Thomas and the reduced state of the Americans, they were far from being in any preparation for the reception of General Carleton, whose arrival they momently expected. They had nothing to hope, and immediate surrender to mercy was their only resource. On this they had determined, when, to their surprise and joy, they were informed that all further pursuit was relinquished, and that the Canadians and British troops had precipitately retreated. Thus the remnant of the broken Continental Army was left at full liberty to escape in the best manner they could from other impending dangers. From the nature of the grounds and from the neighborhood of the savages, from their weak, sickly, and reduced state, their retreat was extremely difficult, but in scattered parties they reached Crown Point in a very feeble condition. After this series of successful efforts, all further thoughts of the reduction and conquest of Canada were for the present laid aside. General Carleton had repaired to Quebec. General Phillips, with a considerable force, made winter quarters at Montreal, and General Burgoyne took passage for England. Both these officers had been very active in aid of Carleton through the campaign of 1776. The defeat of the Americans in Canada and the advantages gained by the British arms in the Jerseys, and indeed for some months in every other quarter, gave to the royal cause an air of triumph. The brilliant hopes formed from these circumstances by the calculators of events for the ensuing spring led the ministry and the army, the nation and their sovereign, to flatter themselves that the completion of the war was at no great distance, and that only one more campaign would be necessary for the entire subjugation of America. The vicissitudes of fortune that hourly cloud or brighten all human affairs soon convinced them that this was but the triumph of a day. The new year opened in a reversive view. A spirited movement of General Washington at this important crisis had a most happy effect. A single incident gave a different face to the affairs of the colonies in a shorter time than could have been imagined, after the ruinous appearance of everything at the close of the campaign. On the evening of the 25th of December, General Washington, in a most severe season, crossed the Delaware with a part of his army, then reduced to less than 2,000 men in the whole. They very unexpectedly landed near Trenton. Colonel Rall, an officer of decided bravery, commanded a detachment of 1,200 Hessians stationed there, where they lay in perfect security. It was near morning before they were alarmed. The surprise was complete, the resistance small. Rall was mortally wounded, and his whole corps surrendered prisoners of war. After the fatigue, the hazards, and the success of the night, General Washington, with his party and his prisoners, consisting of the 3 regiments of Rall, Lofberg, and Knyphausen, recrossed the river before 8 in the morning with little or no loss. End section 33. Section 34 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Leinhart. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 9, Part 5. This adventure gave an astonishing spring to the spirits of the American army and people a short time before driven to the brink of despair. They had viewed the Hessians as a most terrific enemy, and in conjunction with the veterans of Britain as an invulnerable foe. To see such a body of them surprised in their camp and yielding themselves prisoners to the shreds of an American army inspired them with a boldness that an action of the greatest magnitude might not have awakened in different circumstances. General Washington did not sit down in Philadelphia satisfied with the éclat of this enterprise, but in a few days again passed the Delaware and took post at Trenton. The British army, elated by success, had lain carelessly cantoned in small divisions in a line extending through New Jersey to New York. General Howe was afterwards severely censured by his employers for his neglect in not crossing the Delaware while he had the promise of the most brilliant success from his own arms. The panic of the Pennsylvanians had inspired most of them with a disposition to succumb to any terms he should impose, which ought to have been an additional stimulus to have pursued his good fortune. Nor was he less censured for his unguarded cantonments through such an extensive line as the whole length of the Jerseys. Note: see Trial and Defense of General Howe. End note. General Washington moved on from Trenton to Princeton by a circuitous march to avoid engaging the British or being hemmed in near Trenton. He suddenly attacked the British encampment at Princeton while the main body of the British army had marched to Trenton with design to dislodge the Americans from that post. From Princeton, the American army moved to Elizabethtown. Animated by success, warmed by bravery, and supported by fortitude, they gathered strength as they moved, and gained some signal advantages in several places on the Jersey side of the river, and in their turn pursued the King's troops with as much rapidity as they had recently fled before them, while the British, as if seized with a general panic, made but a feeble resistance. After many marches, countermarches, and skirmishes, the strength of the British force was collected at Brunswick, a town in the Jerseys, about 60 miles from Philadelphia and 35 from New York. They continued their headquarters there the remainder of the winter, but they were not without apprehensions for the safety of their troops and their magazines, even at this distance from Philadelphia, notwithstanding the contempt with which they had but a short time before viewed the broken, disheartened remains of a Continental army which they had pursued into the city. The British were indeed very far superior to the Americans in every respect necessary to military operations, except the revivified courage and resolution, the result of sudden success after despair. In this, the Americans at the time yielded the palm to none, while the confidence of their antagonists apparently diminished, and victory began by them to be viewed at a distance. The waste of human life from various causes, through the vicissitudes of this winter, was not inconsiderable on either side, but the success of the American arms through the Jerseys was in some measure damped by the death of the brave General Mercer of Virginia, who fell at Princeton in an action made memorable by the loss of so gallant an officer. His distinguished merit was gratefully acknowledged by Congress in the provision afterwards made for the education and support of the youngest son of his family. The fortunate movements of the Americans at this critical era had the usual effect on public opinion. Such is human nature that success ever brightens the talents of the fortunate commander, and applause generally outruns the expectations of the ambitious. General Washington, popular before, from this period became the idol of his country and the admiration of his enemies. His humanity to the prisoners who fell into his hands was a contrast to the severities suffered by those captured at Fort Washington and the victims in other places that fell under the power of either Hessians or Britons. In a book of general orders belonging to Colonel Rowell, found after the action at Trenton, it was recorded that His Excellency the Commander-in-Chief orders that all Americans found in arms, not having an officer with them, shall be immediately hanged. Note: the intimation of Lord Cornwallis afterwards to the commander of a party sent out, much superior to the Americans they expected to meet, was not more humane. His lordship observed that, quote, he wanted no prisoners, end quote. End note. This instance may serve as a sample of the cruel designs and summary modes of proceeding to execution among military masters who hold themselves above the censure or control of civil authority or the restraints of humanity. On the contrary, the lenity shown by General Washington towards the Loyalists captured by his soldiers disarmed the prejudices of many, and multitudes flocked to the American standard, who, in the beginning of the dispute, were favorers of the royal cause, and within a few months had been ready to throw themselves into the arms of Great Britain. But every favorable impression was erased, and every idea of submission annihilated by the indiscriminate ravages of the Hessian and British soldiery in their route through the Jerseys. The elegant houses of some of their own most devoted partisans were burnt, their wives and daughters pursued and ravished in the woods to which they had fled for shelter. Many unfortunate fathers, in the stupor of grief, beheld the misery of their female connections without being able to relieve them, and heard the shrieks of infant innocence, subjected to the brutal lust of British grenadiers or Hessian yogurs. In short, it may be difficult for the most descriptive pen to portray the situation of the inhabitants of the Jerseys and the neighborhood of their state. The confusion of parties, the dismay of individuals who were still serving in the remnant of the American army, whose dearest connections were scattered through the country and exposed to the danger of plunder and misery from the hostile inroads of a victorious army, can be imagined only by those whose souls are susceptible at once of the noblest and the tenderest feelings. Many of this description were among the brave officers who had led the fragments of a fugitive army across the Delaware and sheltered in the city of Philadelphia, had by flight escaped a total excision. But after escaping the perilous pursuit, there appeared little on which to ground any rational hope of effectually counteracting the designs of their enemies. They found Congress had retreated, and that the inhabitants of the city were agitated and divided. Several of the more wealthy citizens secured their property by renouncing the authority of Congress and acknowledging themselves the subjects of the crown. Others availed themselves of a proclamation of pardon published by the British commander, and took protection under the royal standard for personal security. Several officers of high character and consideration were on the point of pursuing the same steps previous to the action at Trenton, from the anxiety they felt for their families, despair of the general cause, danger of the city, or the immediate military executions that might take place when the victorious army should cross the river, which they momently expected. Why this was not done remains involved among the fortuitous events which often decide the fate of armies or of nations, as it were by accident. The votaries of blind chance, or indeed the more sober calculators on human events, would have pronounced the fortune of the day was in the hands of the British commander. Why he did not embrace her tenders while it was in his power, no one can tell, nor why he stopped short on the borders of the river, as if afraid the waters of the Delaware, like another Red Sea, would overwhelm the pursuers of the injured Americans, who had in many instances as manifestly experienced the protecting hand of Providence as the favored Israelites. The neglect of so fair an opportunity by a single effort to have totally destroyed or dispersed the American army, or in the language of administration, to have cut off the Hydra head of rebellion by the subjugation of the capital city, was viewed in the most unpardonable light by his employers. They were not yet fully apprised of the spirit of Americans. Their ideas did not quadrate with those of a distinguished military officer well acquainted with the country, who observed in a letter to a friend, quote, "It was no exaggeration to assert that there were 200,000 strong-bodied active yeomanry ready to encounter all hazards and dangers, ready to sacrifice all considerations, rather than surrender a tittle of the rights which they have derived from God and their ancestors." End quote. Note: see a letter from General Charles Lee to the Duke of Richmond, October 1774. End note. Subsequent events will prove that he had not formed a mistaken opinion of the resolution and prowess of the Americans. It will be seen that they were far from relinquishing their claim to independence by the ill success of a single campaign. The tardy conduct of Sir William Howe was reprehended with severity, nor was he ever able to justify or vindicate himself either to administration or to the world. From these and other circumstances, the character of Sir William Howe depreciated in proportion to the rising fame of the American commander-in-chief, his rival in glory, and his competitor for the crown of victory on a theater that soon excited the curiosity and awakened the ambition of the heroes and princes of Europe. Indeed, it must be acknowledged that General Howe had innumerable difficulties to surmount, notwithstanding the number of his troops. He was at a distance from his employers, who were ignorant of his situation and unable to support him as emergencies required. He was in an enemy's country, where every acquisition of forage or provisions was procured at the expense or hazard of life or reputation. A considerable part of his army was composed of discontented foreigners, who, disappointed of the easy settlements they had been led to expect from the conquest of rebels and the forfeiture of their estates, their former poverty not mitigated, nor their yoke of slavery ameliorated in the service of their new masters, they were clamorous for pay and too eager for plunder to be kept within the rules of discipline, and their alien language and manners disgusting to their British comrades, a constant bickering was kept up between them. Nor was the British commander less embarrassed by the Tories, who from every state had fled from the resentment of their countrymen and hung upon his hands for subsistence. On their fidelity or their information he could make little dependence. Many of them had never possessed property at all. Others, irritated by the loss of wealth, both were continually urging him to deeds of cruelty to which he did not seem naturally inclined. At the same time, he was sensible that the hopes of his nation would sink by the protraction of a war, which they had flattered themselves might be concluded with the utmost facility and expedition. There were many concurring circumstances to lead the world to conclude that Sir William Howe was not qualified, either by education or habits of life, for the execution of an object of such magnitude as the restoration of the revolted colonies to obedience and dependence on the crown of Britain. Quote, "He fought as a soldier and a servant to his king, without other principle than that of passive obedience. The immensity of the project before him embarrassed his mind, clouded his understanding, and too much engrossed by his bottle and his mistress, he frequently left his orders and his letters to be fabricated by subordinate officers, and seemed at some times to sink into stupor or indolence, at others brave and cool as Julius Caesar." End of section 34. Section 35 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Leinhart. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 9, Conclusion. If these traits of the character of the British commander are just and impartial, as said to be by one of his former associates, the world need be at no loss why such instances of shameful outrage and rapine appeared wherever his army entered, or why, when he had driven the Americans over the Delaware, he did not pursue and complete the business by a triumphal entrance into Philadelphia and the total destruction of General Washington and his remaining troops. Note: see letter of General Lee, Appendix, Note number 18, which discovers the temper and character of the writer, as well as of Sir William Howe. Note number 18. Copy of a letter from General Lee to Dr. B. Rush. See Life and Memoirs of General Lee. Quote, Camp at Valley Forge, June 4th, 1778. My dear Rush, though I had no occasion for fresh assurances of your friendship, I cannot help being much pleased with the warmth which your letter delivered to me by Mr. H. breathes, and I hope it is unnecessary to assure you that my sentiments with respect to you are correspondent. You will think it odd that I should seem to be an apologist for General Howe. I know not how it happens, but when I have taken prejudices in favor or against a man, I find it a difficulty in shaking them off. From my first acquaintance with Mr. Howe, I liked him. I thought him friendly, candid, good-natured, brave, and rather sensible than the reverse. I believe still that he is naturally so, but a corrupt, or more properly, no education, the fashion of the times, and the reigning idolatry amongst the English, particularly the soldiery, for every sceptred calf, wolf, or ass, have so totally perverted his understanding and heart that private friendship has not force sufficient to keep a door open for the admittance of mercy towards political heretics. He was besides persuaded that I was doubly criminal, both as a traitor and deserter. In short, so totally was he inebriated with this idea that I am convinced he would have thought himself both politically and morally damned had he acted any other part than what he did. He is besides the most indolent of mortals, never took further pains to examine the merits or demerits of the cause in which he was engaged, than merely to recollect that Great Britain was said to be the mother country, George III, King of Great Britain, that the Parliament was called the representatives of Great Britain, that the King and Parliament formed the supreme power, that a supreme power is absolute and uncontrollable, that all resistance must consequently be rebellion, but above all, that he was a soldier and bound to obey in all cases whatever. These are his notions, and this his logic. But through these absurdities I could distinguish, when he was left to himself, rays of friendship and good nature breaking out. It is true he was seldom left to himself, for never poor mortal thrust into high station was surrounded by such fools and scoundrels. Mackenzie, Balfour, Galloway were his counselors. They urged him to all his acts of harshness. They were his scribes. All the damned stuff which was issued to the astonished world was theirs. I believe he scarcely ever read the letters he signed. You will scarcely believe it, but I can assure you as a fact that he never read the curious proclamation issued at the head of Elk till 3 days after it was published. You will say that I am drawing my friend Howe in more ridiculous colors than he has yet been represented in, but this is his real character. He is naturally good-humored, complacent, but illiterate and indolent to the last degree, unless as an executive soldier, in which capacity he is all fire and activity, brave and cool as Julius Caesar. His understanding is, as I observed before, rather good than otherwise, but was totally confounded and stupefied by the immensity of the task imposed upon him. He shut his eyes, fought his battles, drank his bottle, had his little blank, advised with his counselors, received his orders from North and Germain, one more absurd than the other, took Galloway's opinion, shut his eyes, fought again, and is now, I suppose, to be called to account for acting according to instructions. But I believe his eyes are now opened. He sees he has been an instrument of wickedness and folly. Indeed, when I observed it to him, he not only took patiently the observation, but indirectly assented to the truth of it. He made, at the same time, as far as his mauvais bonte would permit, an apology for his treatment of me. Thus far with regard to Mr. Howe. You are struck with the great events, changes, and new characters which have appeared on the stage since I saw you last, but I am more struck with the admirable efficacy of blunders. It seemed to be a trial of skill, which party should outdo the other, and it is hard to say which played the deepest strokes. But it was a capital one of ours, which certainly gave the happy turn which affairs have taken. Upon my soul, it was time for fortune to interpose, or we were inevitably lost. But this we will talk over another time. I suppose we shall see one another at Philadelphia very soon, in attendance. God bless you. Yours affectionately, Charles Lee. End note. No military character ever had a fairer opportunity, as observed above, to place the martial laurel on his brow than was presented to General Howe on the banks of the Delaware, but he suffered it to wave at a distance, without the resolution to seize it, and instead of a chaplet of glory, he reaped only the hatred of America, the loss of esteem and reputation in England, and disgrace and censure from his parliamentary masters. The negligence of Sir William Howe gave an opportunity to the Americans to recover the energies of their former courage. The hopeless prospect that had beclouded their minds vanished on the successful termination of a single enterprise projected by the commander-in-chief and executed with resolution and magnanimity by officers who had been almost reduced to despondency. The surprise of Trenton saved the army, the city, and in some degree the reputation of the commander-in-chief, which frequently depends more on the fortunate exigencies of a moment than on superior talents. The world, ever prone to neglect the unfortunate, however brave, amiable, or virtuous, generally pays its idolatrous homage to those elevated by the favors of the ideal deity to the pinnacle of honor. Yet real merit usually commands the plaudit of posterity, however it may be withheld by contemporaries from rivalry or envy. Perhaps there are no people on earth in whom a spirit of enthusiastic zeal is so readily enkindled and burns so remarkably conspicuous as among the Americans. Any fortuitous circumstance that holds out the most distant promise of a completion of their wishes is pushed with an ardor and unanimity that seldom fails of success. This characteristic trait may in some measure account for the rapidity with which everything has been brought to maturity there from the first settlement of the colonies. The energetic operation of this sanguine temper was never more remarkably exhibited than in the change instantaneously wrought in the minds of men by the capture of Trenton at so unexpected a moment. From a state of mind bordering on despair, courage was invigorated, every countenance brightened, and the nervous arm was outstretched as if by one general impulse all were determined to drive the hostile invaders that had plundered their villages and dipped the remorseless sword in the bosom of the innocent victims of their fury from off the American shores. But we shall see in the subsequent pages of these memoirs that they had yet many years to struggle with the dangers, the chances, and the miseries of war before an extensive country, convulsed in every part, was restored to tranquility. Agonizing amidst the complicated difficulties of raising, paying, and keeping an army in the field, it is easy to conceive it was not with much facility that money was drawn from the pockets of the rich for the support of the public cause at the hazard of receiving a scrip of depreciated paper in lieu of silver and gold. A nominal substitute for specie has often its temporary advantages, and when not extended too far, its permanent ones, but is oftener attended with a great balance of evil. Its deceptive value often plunges a great part of the community into ruin and corrupts the morals of the people before they are apprehensive of the danger. Yet without the expedient of a paper currency, the Americans could never have supported an army, or have procured the necessaries of life from day to day. Experience had before taught them the pernicious effects of a paper medium without funds sufficient for its redemption, but the peculiar exigencies of their situation left them no other resources. The United States had engaged in an hazardous enterprise in which all was at stake. Deficient as they were in the means necessary to support a war against a wealthy and potent nation, they yet stood alone, uncertain whether any other power would aid their cause or view them with that degree of consideration that might obtain a credit for foreign loans. It was an interesting spectacle to all such nations as had colonies of their own, to view such an unexpected spirit of resistance and revolt in the Americans as might be contagious, and probably produce commotions as much to be dreaded by them as the alienation of the 13 colonies was by England. The most judicious statesmen in America were sensible that much time must elapse and many events take place before any foreign stipulations could be effected. They were therefore impelled by the peculiar circumstances of their situation to resort to this dangerous expedient or relinquish the contest. No wise legislator, no experienced statesman, no man of principle would have recourse to a measure fraught with such uncertain consequences, but from that necessity which in human affairs sometimes precludes all deliberation between present utility and distant events which may accrue. In consequence of this dilemma, Congress had emitted sums to a vast amount in paper bills, with a promise on the face of the bill of payment in specie at some distant period. This circumstance was alarming to the avaricious and the wealthy, who immediately withdrew their gold and silver from circulation. This and other combining circumstances, among which the immense sums counterfeited in New York by the British and thrown into the colonies, produced an immediate and an astonishing depreciation. At the same time, the widow and the orphan were obliged to receive the interest of their property, deposited for security in the public treasuries according to the nominal sum on the face of the bills, by which they and other classes were reduced to extreme necessity. The operative effects of this paper medium, its uses, its depreciation, and total annihilation, will be seen hereafter, when the credit of the circulating paper had sunk so low that no one presumed to offer it in barter for any commodity. All public demands were consolidated by government at a very great discount, and public securities given to those who had demands for services or loans, and the faith of Congress pledged for their payment in full value as soon as practicable. Note: see Appendix, Note number 19. Note number 19. The iniquitous conduct of speculators and swindlers to secure to themselves the possession of most of the public securities will leave a stain on a large class of people who by every art endeavored to sink the faith of Congress. Indeed, their attempts to injure the credit of all public bodies were attended with the most pernicious consequences to the honest and unsuspecting holders of public paper. By every insidious practice, they induced the ignorant and necessitous to part with their securities for the most trifling considerations, to supply their immediate wants. Thus afterwards, when a new constitution of government was formed and a funding system created, no discrimination was made in favor of the original holders, who had dispossessed themselves of the public securities. Those who had gained them by their artificial deception were enriched beyond all calculation by subsequent circumstances. They afterwards received the nominal value in specie, while many of the former holders were reduced to extreme poverty. It was pathetically observed by one who felt these inconveniences that, quote, The public securities, tired of their humble abodes, had soon fled to the splendid seats of wealth and greatness, and that while they remained with a class who had dearly earned them by their services, no interest was promised, no time, place, or person ascertained to direct our application for payment. They fell into disgrace, which, concurring with our necessities, as they could yield no present comfort or future hope, induced us to part with them for the most trifling considerations. But when they had chosen their elevated residence, their credit revived, and provision was made for the payment of interest upon them. We, in event, literally sold them for nothing, and are obliged to pay their present holders an annual sum for keeping them in possession, for many of us have, or must soon pay, for the interest of them, a sum nearly or quite equal to the money given to purchase them, and still be annually taxed to discharge the interest and principal of said securities." This is an anticipation of what literally took place afterwards, though it is but justice to observe that Mr. Madison of Virginia, a distinguished member of Congress, and several others of that body, left no rational argument untried to procure a discrimination when the funding system was about to be introduced in 1778, that would have made some equitable compensation to the original holders of public securities and prevented a sudden accumulation of wealth to a class of men who had, many of them, never earned by their own private industry or their services to the public sufficient for a competent support. They grew rich on the property of those who had suffered in the service of their country, who were left to complain without a possibility of redress. End note. The honor and the fate of the commander-in-chief had been daily hazarded by the unrestrained license of soldiers, with whom it was optional to stay a few days longer or to withdraw after the short term of their enlistment had expired, however imminent the dangers might be that threatened their country. Yet the establishment of a permanent army was not more ardently wished by General Washington than by every judicious man in America. But the work, though not insurmountable, was attended with complicated difficulties. The reluctance felt through that class of men from which an army was to be drawn to enlist for an indefinite term was apparent to all. The precarious resources for the support of an army, which at that time depended only on a depreciating medium, could not be concealed, and were discouraging indeed. At the same time, it was a subject too delicate to expatiate on, as the more it was conversed upon, the greater was the danger of defeating the desired object. But, the firmness of Congress unshaken, and the legislatures of the individual states equally zealous, while the people at large were convinced of the utility of the measure, the object was in time obtained, though not so rapidly as the exigencies of the day required. End section 35 and chapter 9 conclusion.
Section 36 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1 by Mercy Otis Warren. A reading of the Declaration of Independence. In Congress, July 4, 1776, a declaration of the representatives of the United States of America and General Congress assembled. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form, as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate the governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shewn that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government, and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the rights of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them, and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies in places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing, with manly firmness, his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolution to cause others to be erected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices, and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their subsistence. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their pretended acts of legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefit of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries, so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, by taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, by suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens, taken captive on the high seas, to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress. In the most humble terms, our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince, whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant, is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attention to our British brethren. We have warned them, from time to time, of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them, by the ties of our common kindred, to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They, too, have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation, and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, and that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that, as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Signed by order and in behalf of the Congress. John Hancock, President. Attest, Charles Thompson, Secretary. End of section 36. Section 37 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 10, Battle of Brandywine, Valley Forge. Desultory circumstances, skirmishes and events. General Howe withdraws from the Jerseys, arrives at the River Elk, followed by Washington. The Battle of Brandywine. General Washington defeated, retreats to Philadelphia, obliged to draw off his army. Lord Cornwallis takes possession of the city. Action at Germantown, Red Bank, etc. The British Army takes winter quarters in Philadelphia. The Americans encamp at Valley Forge. General Washington's situation not eligible. Delisle's letters. General Conway resigns. The Baron de Steuben appointed Inspector General of the American Army. In the beginning of the year 1777, the spirits of the Americans were generally reanimated by fresh hopes in consequence of the measures taken by Congress to establish a permanent army until the conclusion of the war, and still more by their sanguine expectations of success from the negotiations and prospects of an alliance with France. A solemn confederation, consisting of a number of articles by which the United States should, in future, be governed, had been drafted, discussed, and unanimously signed by all the delegates in Congress in the month of October, 1776. This instrument was sent to each legislature in the 13 states and approved and afterwards ratified by the individual governments. After this, the Congress of the United States thought proper to appoint commissioners to the court of France, when fortunately a loan of money was negotiated on the faith of the United States, and permission obtained for the reception of American ships of war, and the sale of prizes that might be captured by them, and carried into any of the ports of France. They were also encouraged to hope for still further assistance from the generosity of that nation. The growth of the infant marine of the United States had been so rapid, and so successful had been the adventurers in this early stage of the war, that it was rationally concluded it could not be many years before the Navy of America might make a respectable figure among the nations. It was not expected in Great Britain that the colonies could thus early have acquired a naval force of the least consideration. In consequence of this idea, a great number of British ships and transports that went out slightly armed, or not armed at all, were this year captured on their way to America. So bold and adventurous were the American privateers and their public ships that the domestic trade of Britain was rendered insecure, and a convoy became necessary to protect the linen ships from Dublin to Newry, a circumstance that never before took place. Footnote: British Annual Register 1777. End of footnote. The successful depredations also on the British West India trade were felt through Great Britain in an alarming degree, and shocked their commerce so far as to occasion sudden and frequent bankruptcy in London, Bristol, and almost all the great marts of the nation. Thus the colonies were filled with everything necessary for carrying on a war, or that furnished them the luxuries of life. But the sudden acquisition of wealth, which in consequence of unexpected success flowed into the lap of individuals so much beyond their former fortune or ideas, was not indeed very favorable to the virtual manners of the possessors. It had a tendency to contract the mind, and led it to shrink into selfish views and indulgences, totally inconsistent with genuine republicanism. The coffers of the rich were not unlocked for the public benefit, but their contents were liberally squandered in pursuit of frivolous enjoyments, to which most of them had heretofore been strangers. This avaricious spirit, indeed, somewhat retarded the measures contemplated by Congress, who had determined that the army in future should stand on a more stable footing. They had directed that 88 battalions should be raised and kept in full pay until the close of the war, and as an encouragement to enlist, they promised a certain allotment of lands to both officers and soldiers at the commencement of peace. Yet the recruiting service went on heavily for a time, and at an immense expense to the United States. But among the people whose personal liberty had been their proudest boast, the above was not the sole cause of the difficulty of raising a permanent army. The novelty of being enchained to a standing army was disgusting. They generally revolted at the idea of enlisting for an indefinite term. Thus the army still remained incomplete, and the militia were again called out as before. In that mode there was no want of zeal and alacrity. Great numbers always appeared ready for any temporary service. During the winter of this year, The British commander did not attempt anything of greater magnitude than the destruction of the American magazines. He effected his purpose at Peekskill, at Cortlandt Manor, and about the middle of April he sent on a detachment under the command of Governor Tryon to the little town of Danbury, on the borders of Connecticut, where a considerable quantity of provisions and other articles had been deposited for the use of the American army. He considered it of great importance to cut off these resources before the opening of the spring campaign. In conjunction with Sir William Erskine and Brigadier General Agnew, Governor Tryon, who had embodied near 2,000 royalists, was vested with the principal command on the trivial expedition to Danbury. He executed his orders with alacrity. They destroyed a few hogsheads of rum and sugar, a considerable quantity of grain and other provisions, about 1,700 tents, and plundered and burnt a number of houses in the town of Danbury. But the retreat to their shipping was intercepted by the militia of the country, drawn out by the generals Wooster and Silliman. A small detachment of Continental troops, commanded by General Arnold, with a party of recruiting officers, joined them, and a rencounter ensued, when much bravery was exhibited on both sides. General Wooster, an aged and experienced officer, and a very worthy man, was mortally wounded. General Arnold had his horse shot under him at the moment a soldier had his bayonet lifted for his destruction, but with surprising agility he disengaged himself from his horse and drew a pistol that laid his enemy dead at his feet. On the third day after his landing, Governor Tryon again reached the shipping and re-embarked his troops with inconsiderable loss, though exceedingly fatigued by a march of 30 miles. Harassed the whole time by an enemy arranged on each hand, and pressed in the rear by recruits hourly coming in to the assistance of his opponents. Footnote: it has been acknowledged by some British historians that their loss more than counterbalanced the advantages gained in this expedition to Danbury. End of footnote. Within a few days, reprisals were made for this successful feat of Tryon by the more brilliant enterprise of Colonel Meigs, who, with only 170 men, landed on the southern part of Long Island, surprised the enemy lying at Sag Harbor, burnt 12 armed vessels, captured the sailors, destroyed the forage and stores on the east part of the island, and returned to Gifford, about 90 miles distant, within 30 hours from the time of his departure from thence. He brought with him the trophies of his success, without the loss of a man. As no action of importance was exhibited for several months, these smaller depredations and inconsiderable skirmishes served only to keep the spirits in play, and preserve the mind from that lethargic state which inaction or want of object creates. The plan digested for the summer campaign among the British officers was to gain possession of Philadelphia, to command the central colonies, and to drive the Americans from all their posts in the province of Canada. Some circumstances had taken place that seemed to favor these designs. Confident of his success from his superior numbers in the field, General Howe, for a time, exercised all the artifices of an experienced commander to bring General Washington to a decisive engagement, but from a perfect command of his temper and a judicious arrangement of the few Continental troops and the militia he had in aid, the American chieftain defeated every measure practiced to bring him to a general action. He placed about 2,000 men in Princeton, and with the main body of his army, took his stand on the high and advantageous grounds in the neighborhood, and made all possible preparation for defense. This determined line of conduct in General Washington gave a new turn to British operations. On the 19th of June, General Howe decamped from Brunswick and removed to Amboy, with every appearance of a speedy embarkation. His troops, as usual, committed every outrage on their way, and as if instigated by despair of becoming masters of the country and envious of the progress of arts and sciences in America, the colleges and public libraries were burnt. all public buildings and places of worship swept away, and nothing that had the appearance of distinguished elegance escaped. But the mind and the pen weary of the detail of destruction. It is enough to observe that the British Army in their retreat left every trait of defoliation and barbarism behind them. The maneuvers of the British commander led to the belief, and everything wore the strongest appearance, that he was about to take a final leave of the Jerseys. The illusion succeeded so far as to induce General Washington to send a body of 3,000 men, commanded by the Generals Maxwell, Conway, and Lord Stirling, with design to attack the rear of their march. General Howe, apprised of this movement, hastily returned to the charge. He dispatched Lord Cornwallis on a circuitous route, who soon came up with Lord Stirling, strongly posted in a wood. The Americans determined to dispute the ground with Cornwallis, but the ardor of the British troops and the rivalry of the Hessians obliged them soon to quit their advantageous post and retreat with precipitation. The loss the Americans sustained was not inconsiderable. They suffered greatly, both from the extreme heat of the season and the valor of their antagonists. From this and some other circumstances, it was for a time generally believed that the late movement of General Howe and his army was but a feint to draw General Washington to an action, rather than from a fixed design immediately to evacuate the state of New Jersey. Convinced of this, Washington drew in his lines and recovered his camp on the hills, determined to persevere in his defensive system until some more advantageous opportunity should justify the hazard of a general engagement. It would undoubtedly have been highly imprudent for General Howe at this time to have persisted in pushing his way to the Delaware through a country disgusted and alienated by the barbarity of his troops. Most of the inhabitants of this state were now armed for defense, inflamed by resentment from the sufferings of the last year, impelled by necessity from the impediments in the way of all private occupations, and fired by a love of glory. They were now ardent for action, in proportion as they had been heretofore remiss, and came to the field prepared to conquer or die in defense of their country. At the same time, General Washington was daily gaining strength by the arrival of fresh troops from various other quarters. The British commander, accordingly, thought proper about midsummer to decamp in earnest. He drew off his whole force as privately as possible to New York, thence embarked and sailed from Sandy Hook the 23rd of July. The destination of the fleet and army was kept so profoundly secret that for some time after their embarkation, every capital on the continent was apprehensive that they should be the object of the next visit from a potent armament that seemed at a loss where to direct their operations. This expectation occasioned a general anxiety until the latter part of August, when the fleet appeared in the Chesapeake, and the army soon after landed at the head of the River Elk. On his arrival there, General Howe immediately published a proclamation in which he assured the inhabitants everywhere of safety and protection, provided they were not found in arms, and promised pardon to all officers and soldiers who should surrender to the royal army. Indeed, his disposition to clemency appeared so conspicuous on his first arrival that it prevented the entire depopulation of the adjacent parts of Maryland, Pennsylvania, and the lower counties of Delaware, the inhabitants of which, on the first appearance of so formidable a foe in their neighborhood, were struck with consternation and on the point of abandoning their habitations. It was now obvious that the possession of the city of Philadelphia was the stake for which both armies played. General Washington had moved with the greatest part of his troops for the defense of that elegant city, and had by detached parties embarrassed the march of the British army from the River Elk to the Brandywine. In the neighborhood of the last, the two armies met, and on the 11th of September came to a general engagement. The battle was fought with bravery, and sustained with spirit on both sides, but the fortune of the day declared against the Americans, yet not so decidedly as the sanguine expectations of their antagonists had led them to hope from such an event. But it gave them an astonishing advantage in the minds of the people through all the district of Pennsylvania, and enabled General Howe with more facility to complete his enterprise. Many officers of high rank on both sides suffered much in the spirited action at the Brandywine. A few days after this affair, General Wayne, who had concealed himself in a wood with 1,500 men in order to harass the rear of the British, was discovered and attacked by Brigadier General Gray, who had given orders that no alarm should be made by the use of firearms. He made the onset about 1 o'clock in the morning, and by the more cruel exercise of the bayonet, several hundred Americans were killed and wounded. The remainder with difficulty escaped by flight. Among others who suffered in the Battle of Brandywine, the Marquis de Lafayette, a young nobleman of France, was dangerously wounded. Warmed by an enthusiastic love of liberty, and animated by a laudable ambition, this amiable young gentleman had left the court of France without leave of the king, and quitting the pleasures of domestic felicity, he embarked at his own expense, and engaged in the service of the United States at an early period of the war, when the affairs of America wore the darkest aspect. His zeal and his heroism to the conclusion of the contest placed the well-earned laurel on his brow, and procured him the love, respect, and best wishes of the people throughout America. Indeed, all the French officers in the Continental Army, among whom were many of high consideration, acquitted themselves with distinguished gallantry on this and many other occasions, where the courage of the soldier and the humanity of the officer were called into exercise. General Washington, obliged to retreat in disorder, and closely pursued after the action, retired to Chester. He soon after with his army reached Philadelphia, but the British commanders directed their operations with so much judgment and success that before the 26th of September, Washington thought proper to evacuate the city. Lord Cornwallis, with the British grenadiers and 2 battalions of Hessians, on that day made a triumphal entry and took possession of the capital of the United States. End of section 37. Section 38 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1 by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 10, Part 2. The error was truly critical. Congress again found it necessary, a second time, to desert the city, and now repaired to Yorktown for safety. Dissensions ran high among the inhabitants of Philadelphia. Some of the most opulent families were disaffected, and renounced all adherence to the Union, and several persons of different descriptions, emboldened by the absence of Congress and the success of the British arms, took this opportunity to declare in favor of the royal cause. One of principal consideration among them went out and conducted the king's troops into the city. Others declared themselves zealously attached to the measures of administration, and equally disgusted with the opposition of the colonies. Among these was Joseph Galloway, a member of Congress and Speaker of the House of Representatives in Pennsylvania. He soon after repaired to England, where he indefatigably exerted his abilities and his influence against his native country on all occasions. Besides those individual apostates, the Quaker interest had long embarrassed every public measure in that colony. They were a large and powerful body in the state of Pennsylvania, and notwithstanding their pacific principles, though not actually in arms, they at this time took a decided part against the American cause. Their previous conduct had drawn upon themselves many severities. Several of the principal leaders had been imprisoned, and others sent out of the city of Philadelphia on the approach of the British Army. Yet still they refused the smallest submission to the present government and appealed to the laws by which they claimed personal safety. But whether from a consideration of the necessity of a temporary suspension of law in times of public and imminent danger, or whether from the sanguine resolutions which operate on all parties when their favorite system totters on the brink of ruin, little regard was paid even to the legal claims of this body of citizens. Several persons of the first distinction and character among them, notwithstanding their just and sensible remonstrances, were sent off to Virginia to prevent the influence they might have through a state, then the principal seat of war. From these political dissensions, the partial defeats, the loss of Philadelphia, the slowness of recruits for permanent service, the difficulty of obtaining supplies for the army from various causes, and particularly from the monopolizing and avaricious spirit that was fast gaining ground in America, and from delay, the betrayer of all confederations. A lowering aspect was cast over the operations of America on every side. On the contrary, the British government, the army, and their adherents had much reason to flatter themselves with an idea of the speedy completion of their designs against the United States. They were now in possession of the first city in the Union. General Clinton was in force at New York, General Vaughan on the North River, with troops sufficient to sweep away the inhabitants on both sides, and to keep the adjacent country in awe. A large detachment of the British army still held possession of Newport. Colonel Losborg, with the Hessian Brigade in conjunction with them, was periodically plundering the neighboring coasts and burning the scattered villages of the state of Rhode Island. It is proper here to observe that soon after the British troops had taken possession of Rhode Island, some animosities had arisen between General Howe and Lord Percy, who commanded there. This was occasioned by a requisition from Sir William Howe to his lordship to send him on 1,500 men for the better defense of New York, and to aid his operations in that quarter. Lord Percy declined a compliance with this order, alleging as a reason for this refusal that the Americans were rapidly collecting and strengthening themselves in the town of Providence, that the number of troops already there gave them reason to be apprehensive for the safety of Newport. General Howe resented the refusal, threatened Earl Percy with a trial for disobedience of orders, and reprimanded him in language which the Earl thought derogatory to an officer of his rank, character, and consequence. On this usage, which Lord Percy considered very affrontive, he immediately wrote to his father, the Duke of Northumberland, requesting him without delay to obtain his recall from the American service. Soon after this he embarked for England, having resigned his command to General Prescott. His advance to the chief command of the troops on Rhode Island was not long enjoyed by General Prescott before a circumstance took place which was sufficiently mortifying to himself and the British. In the beginning of July 1777, Colonel Barton, a provincial officer, and several others, accompanied by only 38 men, embarked in several boats from Warwick Neck, eluding the vigilance of the British ships and guard boats. He and his party passed them in the dark, and landed on Rhode Island about 12 o'clock at night. Colonel Barton had received some intelligence of the insecure situation in which the British commander frequently lodged on the island. On this information he formed the bold design of surprising and seizing him. This he effected with a facility beyond his own most sanguine expectations. Having first secured the sentinel at the door, he surprised General Prescott in his bed. One of his aides leaped from a window in hopes of escape, but was prevented. Their design accomplished, the little party hastened to their boats with all possible expedition. Signals were made for an alarm on shore, but it was too late. Barton and his party were out of danger. When they reached the spot from whence they had set out on this adventure, A chariot was prepared for the reception of General Prescott, in which he was escorted safely from Warwick to Providence. Colonel Barton received great applause from his countrymen for his spirited and well-executed enterprise. It was not indeed an object of much magnitude, but the previous circumstances of General Prescott's conduct had been such as to render his capture a subject of much exultation to the Americans. He had, while in command at Newport, insulted and abused the inhabitants, ridiculed the American officers, and set a price upon some of their heads, particularly on that of General Arnold, which Arnold retaliated with the advertisement of a small price for the head of General Prescott. The similarity of circumstances that attended the capture of the Generals Prescott and Lee, and their rank in the armies to which they respectively belonged, rendered it highly proper that an exchange should have taken place immediately. It was, however, for a time delayed, but finally General Lee obtained his liberty in consequence of this business. The discouraging circumstances above related with regard to the arrangements, military posts, and operations of the British. From Newport to New York, and from New York to Philadelphia, gave very promising prospects of success to the British in that part of America. At the same time, General Burgoyne, with the flower of the British Army, the Canadian provincials, and hordes of savages that poured down from beyond the lakes, was making advances, and in the language of bombast and self-confidence, threatened destruction and vengeance to any who should have hardihood enough to endeavor to stop his progress or to oppose the authority under which he acted. But notwithstanding the general wayward appearance of the affairs of the United States, the legislatures, as we shall see, lost not their magnanimity, the people their ardor, nor the army their valor. Not disheartened by the circumstances of the last action at the Brandywine, or the loss of Philadelphia, General Washington, with his brave troops, in numbers comparatively inconsiderable, kept the British army in play until the setting in of winter. Within a few days after the surrender of Philadelphia, the Americans attacked the royal camp at Germantown, situated about 6 miles from the city, where the main body of the British army had taken their stand. This was a very unexpected maneuver. The attempt was bold, and the defense brave. The Americans, for a time, seemed to have greatly the advantage, but the enterprise finally failed. They were obliged to retreat in great confusion after the heavy loss of many officers and men. The disappointment of the Americans was in consequence of the address and ability of Colonel Musgrove, who judiciously stood on the defensive and checked the progress of the Continental troops until General Gray and Brigadier General Agnew, with a large detachment, came to his relief. A warm but short action ensued, when the Americans were totally routed and driven out of the field of action. General Lee, who had not the highest opinion of General Washington's military abilities, observed on this occasion that by a single stroke of the bathos, the partial victory at Germantown was corrupted into a defeat. Footnote: General Lee's letters. End of footnote. This was, however, too severe a censure. A number of circumstances cooperated to blast the hopes of the Americans after the early promise of success. The Britons themselves have given testimony to the bravery and good conduct of Washington and his army on this occasion. One of their writers has attested, in this action, the Americans acted upon the offensive, and though repulsed, with loss, showed themselves a formidable adversary, capable of charging with resolution and retreating with order. The hope, therefore, entertained from the effect of any fair action with them, as decisive and likely to put a speedy termination to the war, was exceedingly abated. The highest expectation had been formed on the reduction of Philadelphia, both by the foreign and internal foes of America. Though both armies were fired with equal ardor, and on all occasions were equally ready for action, yet the repeated skirmishes for several weeks in the neighborhood of the city were not productive of any very important consequences, except the loss of many brave men and several officers of great merit. None of these were more distinguished and lamented than General Nash on the American side, and Brigadier General Agnew and Colonel Byrd of the British line, who lost their lives in the Battle of Germantown. It was very important to the British commander, after the above transactions, to open a free passage to Philadelphia by the Delaware, in order to obtain supplies of provisions by water for their army. This was impeded by the American shipping and by several strong posts held by the Americans on the river, the principal of which was Red Bank. Here they had an opportunity of retrieving the recent disgrace of their arms at Germantown. The Hessians, under the command of Colonel Donop, had the principal hand in this business. He crossed the Delaware with 1,500 men at Cooper's Ferry opposite Philadelphia, and marched to attack the redoubts at Red Bank. A cannonade was opened. The camp was attacked with spirit and defended with equal gallantry by Colonel Greene of Rhode Island, who replied to the summons of Count Donop to surrender, that he should defend the place to the last extremity. On this, the Hessians attempted to storm the redoubts, but the assailants were obliged to retreat in their turn. One Hessian brigade was nearly cut to pieces in the action, and Count Donop mortally wounded and taken prisoner, as were several other officers of consideration. The remainder retreated with great precipitation through the night, leaving one half of their party dead, wounded, or prisoners to the Americans, crossed the river the next morning, and in this mortified situation, the remnant who escaped entered Philadelphia. This important pass was a key to the other posts on the river, and for its brave defense the officers and soldiers were justly applauded, and Colonel Greene complimented by Congress with a present of an elegant sword. After the action at Red Bank, the vigilance and caution of General Washington could not be overcome by the valor and advantages of his foes, so far as to induce him to hazard any action of consequence. Footnote: for this, General Washington was very severely censured by some, and even the legislature of the state of Pennsylvania remonstrated to Congress and expressed their uneasiness that the American commanders should leave the capital in possession of the enemy and retire to winter quarters. But his little army, destitute of every necessary, without the possibility of a supply at that season, was a sufficient apology. End of footnote. The design of opening the Delaware was now the principal object with the British commander. This was effected without much difficulty after the reduction of Mud Island. From this strong post, the Americans were obliged to retreat after a very manly resistance. They did not evacuate their works until reduced to despair by some British ships advantageously playing upon them. From the very superior advantages of their enemies in many respects, they were induced to set fire to everything within reach, and after great slaughter, they abandoned the place, which had already cost them too much in its defense. Footnote: the writer of this work does not aim at a particular description or detail of all the engagements, battles, and rencounters between the two contending armies. A general sketch of the most material military movements completes her design, the primary object of which is not a dry narrative of military havoc. End of footnote. In the struggle to open the Delaware, the Augusta and the Merlin on the part of Britain were lost, but the losses of the Americans were far beyond those of the British. The Delaware frigate and some others were captured, and several ships burned by themselves to prevent their falling into the hands of their enemies. End of section 38. Section 39 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 10, Part 3. Nothing more decided than the above transactions took place this season. The Delaware River thus cleared, and eligible winter quarters secured for the King's troops, and the cold season fast advancing. General Howe gave up the pursuit of the cautious and wary Washington. He found it impossible, with all his efforts, to bring him to another general action, while his own judgment and that of the most judicious of his officers forbade it, and common prudence dictated the probable disadvantages of such a movement. His numbers were too small, and the wants of the army too many, to hazard anything. The most guarded and prudent defense was the only line of conduct left to the American commander. These circumstances induced General Howe, about the middle of December, to draw the main body of his army into the city of Philadelphia. They were indeed unable longer to keep the field, being very destitute of tents and other equipage necessary for the army in a cold climate, at this inclement season. Thus, after the proud vaunts of victory and conquest, and the loss of many gallant officers and brave men, the British commander had little to boast at the conclusion of the campaign, but the possession of a city abandoned by the best of its inhabitants, and the command of the adjacent country, circumscribed within the narrow limits of 20 miles. This was but a small compensation for the waste of life and treasure. It was a gloomy picture of the termination of a campaign. For Sir William Howe to convey to his master and to his countrymen, after the exultation for some partial successes had flattered them with the highest hopes of speedy and complete victory. Yet, notwithstanding these vauntings over a people, among whom there did not yet appear a probability of complete subjugation by the sword, nor the smallest traces of a disposition among the people of America to yield obedience to the laws and requisitions which the government of Great Britain were attempting thus to enforce at the point of a bayonet. After Sir William Howe had retired and taken winter quarters in the city, a novel scene, considering the weakness of the Continental Army, was exhibited without. To the surprise and wonder of their foes, and to the admiration of all mankind acquainted with the circumstances, the Americans, nearly destitute of tents, fully supplied with provisions, almost without shoes, stockings, blankets, or other clothing, cheerfully erected themselves huts of timber and brush, and encamped for the winter at a place called Valley Forge, within 25 miles of the city of Philadelphia. Thus, in the neighborhood of a powerful British army, fearless of its numbers and strength, a striking proof of their intrepidity in suffering and their defiance of danger was exhibited by a kind of challenge bidden to their enemies, not very usual in similar situations. The commander-in-chief and several of the principal officers of the American army, in defiance of danger, either to themselves or to such tender connections, sent for their ladies from the different states to which they belonged, to pass the remainder of the winter, and by their presence to enliven the gloomy appearance of a hutted village in the woods, inhabited only by hungry and half-naked soldiery. Footnote: nothing but the inexperience of the American ladies and their confidence in the judgment of their husbands could justify this hazard to their persons and to their feelings of delicacy. End of footnote. The resolution and patience of this little army surmounted every difficulty. They waited long, amidst penury, hunger, and cold, for the necessary supplies, which, in spite of the utmost exertions of the several states, came in but too slowly. Such was the deficiency of horses and wagons for the ordinary as well as extraordinary occasions of the army, that the men, in many instances, cheerfully yoked themselves to little carriages of their own construction. Others loaded the wooden provisions on their backs for present supply, in their extreme necessity. General Washington informed a committee sent from Congress to inquire into the state of the army, that some brigades had been some days without meat, and that the common soldiers had frequently been at his quarters to make known their distresses. Unprovided with materials to raise their cold lodgment from the ground, the dampness of the situation and the wet earth on which they lay occasioned sickness and mortality to rage among them to an astonishing degree. Indeed, nothing could surpass their suffering, except the patience and fortitude with which it was endured by the faithful part of the army. Those of a different character deserted in great numbers. Footnote. See a letter from the committee sent from Congress to Mr. Lawrence, the President. End of footnote. In this weak and dangerous situation, the American Army continued encamped at Valley Forge from December till May, while the British troops in high health and spirits lay in Philadelphia without once attempting to molest them. For this want of vigor and enterprise, General Howe was severely and justly censured in Britain, blamed by those interested in his success in America, and ridiculed by the impartial observer in every quarter. By his negligence this winter, he again undoubtedly lost the fairest opportunity of executing the designs of his master and acquiring to himself much military fame. But by wasting his time in effeminate and reprehensible pleasures, he sunk his character as an officer, and few scrupled to assert that the man of honor and valor was lost for a time in the arms of a handsome adulteress. Many of his officers followed his example, and abandoned themselves to idleness and debauchery, while the soldiers were left to indulge their own licentious habits. At this period, though not attacked by a foreign foe, the situation of the American commander-in-chief was really not very enviable. It required the utmost prudence and address to keep together the appearance of an army under the complicated miseries they must feel, in the depth of winter, hungry and barefooted, whose fatiguing, circuitous marches over the snowy path had been marked by their bleeding feet before they, in such a destitute predicament, pitched their tents in the valley. The dilatory spirit of some, and the peculating dispositions of other officers in the various public departments, increased every difficulty with regard to clothing and subsistence. The deplorable state of the sick, the corrupt conduct in some of the hospitals, the want of discipline among the soldiers, the inexperience of officers, the slowness of the recruits, and the diminution of the old army from various causes, were circumstances discouraging indeed, and might have been considered, if not a balance, at least a weight in the scale, against the advantages and the pride of high station. Yet these were not all the embarrassments which the commander-in-chief had to encounter. General Washington had his personal enemies to combat, nor was he without his rivals for power and fame. Footnote. Both the conduct and letters of General Lee had in several instances confirmed the opinion that he was ambitious of obtaining the chief command of the Army of the United States, and doubtless he had a party that for a short time flattered these expectations. At this time, indeed, he was a prisoner, but his correspondences were extensive. End of footnote. In all communities, there are some restless minds who create jealousies and foment divisions that often injure the best cause and the most unimpeachable character, and it may be observed that there is ever a spirit of intrigue and circumvention that runs parallel with the passions of men. Thus the fortune of war is frequently changed by dangerous emulations, and the best systems of social and political happiness overthrown by the envy and resentment of little minds, or the boundless ambition of more exalted souls. Nor was it many years before America discovered she had in her bosom her Caesars and her Catalines, as well as her Brutuses and her Catos. Many persons were disgusted with the dictatorial powers vested in General Washington after the action at Trenton, which they alleged were at his own request. These were ample indeed. He was empowered by Congress to reform and new model the military arrangements in such manner as he judged best for the public service. He was also vested with several other discretionary powers. Footnote, see Resolves of Congress. End of footnote. Congress had indeed limited its power to 6 months, but exigencies of the highest necessity had urged him sometimes to exercise it in a manner too arbitrary for the principles and dispositions of Americans, unused to the impressment of their property for the use of armies. In this state of affairs, the commander was attacked by anonymous letters, fictitious signatures, and incendiary suggestions. He was censured for his cool operations, defensive movements, and Fabian slowness. Disadvantageous impressions were made on the minds of some, and others were led to believe that General Washington was not without his weaknesses and his foibles. It was observed by one of his principal officers that decision is often wanting in minds otherwise valuable. Footnote, see a letter from General Reed to General Lee, afterwards published. End of footnote. That decision is often wanting in minds otherwise valuable. That an indecisive mind in a commander is one of the greatest misfortunes that could befall an army. That he had often lamented this circumstance through the campaign, that they were in a very awful situation, in an alarming state, that required the utmost wisdom and firmness of mind. A wish at this time undoubtedly prevailed among some distinguished characters for his supersedence of his command. Footnote, Samuel Adams of Boston, General Mifflin, and several other characters of distinction were suspected of unfriendly designs toward the commander-in-chief. But there never were sufficient grounds to suppose that Mr. Adams ever harbored any disaffection to the person of General Washington. On the contrary, he respected and esteemed his character, and loved the man. But zealous and ardent in the defense of his injured country, he was startled at everything that appeared to retard the operations of war, or impede the success of the Revolution, a revolution for which posterity is as much indebted to the talents and exertions of Mr. Adams as to those of anyone in the United States. General Mifflin was a young gentleman of warm and sanguine disposition, active and zealous. He engaged early in opposition to the measures of the British Parliament. He took arms, and was among the first officers commissioned on the organization of a continental army. For this he was read out of the Society of Quakers, to which himself and his family had belonged. But Mr. Mifflin's principles led him to consider himself under a moral obligation to act offensively as well as defensively, and vigorously to oppose the enemies of his country. And from his character and principles, he undoubtedly wished to see a commander-in-chief of the United Armies who would admit of no delay in the acceleration of the object in which they were engaged. End of footnote. But Washington, cool, cautious, and more popular than any man, his good genius was ever at hand to preserve his character invulnerable. Yet several circumstances confirmed the opinion that even some members of Congress at this period were intriguing for his removal. It might indeed at this time have had a fatal effect on American affairs, had General Washington fallen beneath a popular disgust, or the intrigues of his enemies. Perhaps few other men could have kept together the shadow of an army under such a combination of difficulties as the young republic had to encounter, both in the field and the cabinet. Many men of more active and enterprising spirit might have put a period to the war in a shorter space of time, yet perhaps not ultimately so much in favor of America as the slow, defensive movements of the officer then vested with the chief command. This line of conduct was thought by some to be not so much owing to his superior sagacity and penetration as to a constitutional want of ardency, at times when energy appeared most necessary to many persons. A predilection in favor of a connection with Britain seemed united with this disposition. It had appeared clearly by many circumstances, in conversation with his confidential friends, that he was not in the beginning of opposition fond of a final separation from the parent state, and that he wished to move defensively until some events might take place that would bring back and with honor and dignity reunite the revolted colonies to the bosom of their ancient parent. Footnote: in the early period of the war, many very worthy characters opposed to the British system, besides General Washington, wished for a reconciliation with Great Britain, if it could be procured consistently, with honor, and with sufficient pledges of security to the just claims of the colonies, rather than an irrevocable separation. But time convinced all that nothing but independence and a total dismemberment could secure the liberties of the United States. End of footnote. But the public opinion always in his favor, with a happy talent to secure the confidence of the people, he commanded in a remarkable manner their affections, their resources, and their attachment to the end of the war, and had the good fortune to parry every charge brought against him with the firmness of the soldier, though not without the sensibility of the man who found his reputation at stake. He complained heavily to his private friends, yet took no public notice of the vague imputations of slander that fell from the pen of a French officer of distinction under the signature of De Lisle. End of section 39. Section 40 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren. Conclusion. These letters were fraught with the most severe strictures on the general's military character and abilities. Some other letters in the same style and manner, without a name, were directed to gentlemen of character and consideration in several of the states. Some addressed to Patrick Henry, the governor of the state of Virginia. He immediately transmitted to Congress and to the general himself. However boldly some of the charges were urged, they made little impression on the public mind. The transient tale of the day passed as the pathless arrow, without leaving a trace behind. His enemies shrunk from the charge, and General Washington, by the current of applause that always set in his favor, became more than ever the idol of the army and the people. General Conway, the reputed author of the letters signed De Lisle, was a gentleman of great military talents and experience, with an ambition equal to his abilities. He had left France with high expectations of rank in the service of the United States. Not satisfied with the appointment of Inspector General of the American Army, his pride wounded, and disappointed that he did not sustain a higher grade in office, which he had been led to flatter himself with before he left his country, and disgusted by the suspicions that fell upon him after the publication of De Lisle's letters, he resigned his commission and returned to Europe. Conway was not the only officer of his country that suffered similar mortifications. The credulity of men of talents, family, and merit had been imposed on by the indiscretion of one of the American agents, and their imaginations fired by ideas of rank and preferment in America, to which no foreigner was entitled. Footnote: Silas Deane, the first agent sent by Congress to France. End of footnote. Thus, chagrined from the same cause, it was thought that Valiant Cordray, an officer of distinguished name and merit, who was a brigadier general and chief engineer in the French service, lived voluntarily to his watery grave. His death, indeed, was attributed to the fleetness of his horse, which it was said he could not command. Having occasion to cross the Schuylkill, in company with some other officers, he entered a boat on horseback. The career was swift, the catastrophe fatal. He leaped on one side of the boat, and with equal celerity out on the other. Thus both horse and rider were irretrievably lost. Cordray was beloved and lamented by all who knew him, and the loss of Conway was regretted by many who esteemed him for his literary abilities and his military talents. The important office of Inspector General, relinquished from necessity by General Conway, was immediately conferred on the Baron de Steuben, an officer with the best credentials, who had recently arrived from Germany. The essential services of this celebrated disciplinarian were in a very short time felt throughout the army. New regulations took place, and new arrangements were made in the hospitals, in the commissaries, the quartermasters, and other departments, which had been shamefully abused, not from a want of capacity or integrity in the preceding inspectors, but from the ignorance, inexperience, or peculation of many of the subordinate officers. From the date of the Baron's advancement, a more thorough knowledge of tactics was acquired by the officers. More system, discipline, and order appeared in the army. More equitable and permanent regulations, and a stricter adherence to the rules and laws of war, took place than had been observed at any period before. The merits of this officer, universally acknowledged, were afterwards generously rewarded by the Congress of the United States. It may not, however, be improper to observe, before we pass on to the subsequent circumstances of the war, that though the Baron de Steuben had been promoted to the rank of Inspector General by the approbation of Congress and the army, yet General Conway had a considerable party attached to him among the military officers. Many persons thought that his dismissal from office and permission to return to France, under the degradation of character which fell upon him, without any specified charges of delinquency in office, or any solid proofs that he really had been the author of the anonymous reproaches thrown on the character of General Washington, was at once affrontive both to himself and his nation. These ideas are more clearly exhibited in a sketch of the life of Conway by another hand. Footnote: extracts of a short account of the treatment of Major General Conway, laid in the service of America, from General Lee's letters. On Monday, the 23rd of November, 1778, the Honorable Major General Conway set out from Philadelphia on his return to France. The history of the treatment this gentleman has received is so singular that it must make a figure in the anecdotes of mankind. He was born in Ireland, but at the age of 6 was carried into France, was bred up from his infancy to the profession of arms, and it is universally allowed by the gentlemen of that nation that he has, in their service, the reputation of being what is called un très brave major d'infanterie, which is no small character. It implies, if I comprehend the term aright, a man possessed of all the requisite qualities to fill the duties of a general officer in the secondary line, but by no means ranks him among those favored mortals to whom it has pleased God to give so large a portion of the ethereal spirit, as to render reading, theory, and practice unnecessary. But with the spectacle of this phenomena, heaven entertains the earth but very seldom. Greece, as historians report, had but one. Rome none. England and France only one each. As to this hemisphere, I shall be silent on the subject, lest I should be suspected of not being serious. But be this as it may, it is past doubt that General Conway is a man of excellent understanding, quick and penetrating, that he has seen much service, has read a great deal, and digested well what he has read. It is not less certain that he embarked with the warmest zeal for the great American cause, and it has never been insinuated, unless by those who have the talent of confounding causes, that his zeal has diminished. His recompense has been what? He has lost his commission. He has been refused the common certificate, which every officer receives at the expiration of his services, unless his delinquencies have been very substantial indeed. And for what crime? For none, by any law, or the most strained construction that could be put on any law. The reasons given are so far from being substantial that they really ought to reflect honor on his character. It seems he has been accused of writing a letter to a confidential friend, communicating an opinion that the commander-in-chief was not equal to the great task he was charged with. Is this a crime? The contrary. It was really his opinion. It was decent. It was honest. It was laudable. It was his duty. Does it come under any article of war? I may venture to affirm that it does not. God help the community that should be absurd enough to frame a law which could be construed into such a sense. Such a community could not long subsist. It ever has been, and ever ought to be, the custom in all armies, not absolutely barbarians, for the officers of high rank minutely to canvass the measures of their commander-in-chief, and if his faults and mistakes appear to them many and great, to communicate their sentiments to each other. It can be attended with no one bad consequence, for if the criticisms are unjust and impertinent, they only recoil on the authors, and the great man who is the subject of them shines with redoubled luster. But if they are well-founded, they tend to open the eyes of the prince or state, who, from blind prejudice or some strange infatuation, may have reposed their affairs in hands ruinously incapable. Does any man of sense, who is the least acquainted with history, imagine that the greatest generals the world ever produced have escaped censure? Hannibal, Caesar, Turenne, Marlborough have all been censured, and the only method they thought justifiable of stopping the mouths of their censors was by a fresh exertion of their talents and a perpetual series of victories. Indeed, it is observable that in proportion to the capacity or incapacity of the commander-in-chief, he countenances or discountenances the whole tribe of tale-bearers, informers, and pickbacks, who ever have been and ever will be the bane of those courts and armies where they are encouraged or even suffered, allowing General Washington to be possessed of all the virtues and military talents of Epaminondas. And this is certainly allowing a great deal, for whether from our modern education or perhaps the modern state of human affairs, it is difficult to conceive that any mortal in these ages should arrive at such perfection, but allowing it to be so, he would still remain mortal, and of course subject to the infirmities of human nature. Sickness or other casualties might impair his understanding, his memory, or his courage, and in consequence of this failure, he might adopt measures apparently weak, ridiculous, and pernicious. Supposing this possible case, whether a law, the letter or spirit of which should absolutely seal up the lips, and restrain the pens of every witness of the defection, would it not, in fact, be denouncing vengeance against those who alone have the means in their power of saving the public from the ruin impending, if they should dare to make use of these means for its salvation? If there were such a law, its absurdity would be so monstrously glaring that we may hardly say it would be more honored in the breach than in the observance. In the English and French armies, the freedom with which the conduct and measures of commanders-in-chief are canvassed is notorious, nor does it appear that this freedom is attended with any bad consequences. It has never been once able to remove a real great officer from his command. Every action of the Duke of Marlborough, everybody who has read must know, was not only minutely criticized, but his whole conduct was dissected in order to discover some crime, blunder, fault, or even a trifling error. But all these impertinent pains and wicked industry were employed in vain. It was a court intrigue alone that subverted him. General Wolfe, with whom to be compared, it can be no degradation to any mortal living, was not merely criticized, but grossly calumniated by some officers of high rank under him. But that great man never thought of having recourse to the letter or construction of any law in order to avenge himself. He was contented with informing his calumniators that he was not ignorant of their practices, and that the only method he should take for their punishment would be an active perseverance in the performance of his duty, which, with the assistance of God, he made no doubt would place him beyond the reach of their malice. As to what liberties they had taken with him personally, he should wait till he was reduced to the rank of a private gentleman, and then speak to them in that capacity. Upon the whole, it appears that it never was understood to be the meaning of the English Article of War, which enjoins respect towards the Commander-in-Chief. And, of course, it ought not to be understood that the meaning of that article of the American Code, which is a servile copy from the English, is meant to prescribe the communication of our sentiments to one another, on the capacity or incapacity of the man on whom the misery or ruin of the state depends. Its intention was, without doubt, in part complimentary, and partly to lay some decent restrictions on the license of conversation and writing, which otherwise might create a dissidence in the minds of the common soldiery, detrimental to the public service. But that it was meant to impose a dead, torpid silence, in all cases whatever, on men who, from their rank, must be supposed to have eyes and understanding. Nothing under the degree of an idiot can persuade himself, but admitting, in opposition to common sense and all precedents, the proceeding to be criminal, admitting Mr. Conway guilty of it, to the extent represented, which he can demonstrate to be false, in the name of God, why inflict the highest, at least negative punishment on a man untried and unheard? The refusal of a certificate of having honestly served is considered as the greatest of negative punishments. Indeed, in the military idea, it is a positive one. And I sincerely hope and do firmly believe, such is my opinion of the Justice of Congress, that when they have coolly reflected on the merits and fortunes of this gentleman, they will do him that justice, which nothing but the hasty misconstruction of a law, hastily copied from another law, never defined nor understood, has hitherto prevented. End of footnote. We shall only further observe that the French nation was not disposed to resent individual slights, or even public neglects at this interesting period, a nation who viewed the resistance of the American colonies to the overbearing power of Britain on a broad scale. They considered their opposition, if successful, as at once redounding to their own interest and to the promotion of the liberties of mankind in general. It had for many years been a primary object with the House of Bourbon to humble the pride and power of Britain. No contingencies that had arisen among the nations for near a century appeared so likely to produce this effect as an alienation from and a total loss of their colonies. This consideration heightened the natural ardor and quickened the constitutional energies of every Frenchman to lend his hand to the work. Their characteristic impetuosity always appeared conspicuous in politics and war, as well as in the intrigues of love and gallantry. They were ever restless under any appearance of slowness that might retard the execution of their object. But the critical situation of the American army at this period rendered an attempt to lessen the influence and the character of the Commander-in-Chief dangerous and inexcusable. Notwithstanding the freedom of opinion and the license of the press, which should never be too much restrained in a free country, there are times and circumstances which require silence, and however disposed anyone might be to censure the conduct of General Washington, either for the want of enterprise, alacrity, or military skill, yet perhaps no man in the United States, under the pressure of so many difficulties, would have conducted with more discretion and judgment. If there was any error in the dismissal of General Conway, it might be in not observing a due degree of delicacy, or furnishing any testimonials of his having acquitted himself well in his military capacity, a point on which all in that line are very tenacious. The displacing of a single officer of any rank is not sufficiently important to dwell upon long, and the apology for having done it at all must be the danger at this time of disgusting a foreign corps belonging to a court whose assistance was necessary and whose aid had been courted, though their faith was not yet absolutely pledged to promote the emancipation of the United States. France, however, was looking with too eager and steady an eye on the operations and success of the resistance of the colonies to the measures and mandates of the Crown and Parliament of England, to be moved by any partial considerations from the line of political conduct which they had adopted. This was to embrace the first favorable opportunity, when contingent circumstances might promise success, to support the claim of independence, and render the breach complete and durable between the United States and Great Britain, and thereby deprive that rival nation of the immense advantages they had already reaped, and might again recover by a revival and continuance of the connection. That part of the American army immediately under the command of General Washington must now be left encamped at Valley Forge for the winter. Their situation impels the mind to throw over them that veil of compassion, with the season of perplexity, though not of absolute despair, requires. We must now look over and survey with an anxious eye, and in the succeeding pages view the humiliating events which for a time attended the fortune of war in the Northern Department, and trace the footsteps of the soldier through the forlorn desert, which was ultimately the path to victory and glory. End of Volume 1. End of Section 40. End of The Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren.